There's actually a neurochemical basis for controlling stress and actually making stress more tolerable and extending one's ability to be in bouts of effort. And that relates to the dopamine pathway. So the molecule dopamine is a reward. It's released in the brain when you win a game, you close a deal, you meet the love of your life,
someone likes
your photo, the great love of your life, you complete something. But most of our dopamine release is not from achieving goals. It's actually released when we are en route to our goals, where we're in pursuit of our goals, and we think we're on the right path.
This is why a lot of people get depressed after they achieve a big goal, because they feel like, I'm supposed to feel something greater. I felt this thing for 2 minutes, and now that's it?
That's right. High achievers know to attach dopamine to the effort process.
To the pursuit, the day-to-day tasks, the growth, the lessons, the losses, like everything, right?
Well, and it can be to some wins along the way,
Yeah.
but growth mindset, which is the academic discovery and laboratory discovery of my colleague Carol Dweck at Stanford, is the hallmark of growth mindset is really two things. One is, I'm not where I want to be now, but I'm capable of getting there eventually. The other is to attach a sense of reward to the effort process itself. In fact,
Don't reward the result, reward the effort.
That's right. And if you look at true high performers, people that are consistently good at what they do, they don't peak and go through the postpartum depression and crash and come back, and their life is a cycle of ups and downs, but really people who are on that upward trajectory consistently, those people attach dopamine to the effort process. And actually, one of her original studies on the discovery of growth mindset was these kids that loved doing math problems that they knew they couldn't get right. So it's like the people love puzzles, but in this case, they knew they couldn't get it right, but they loved doing it. And incidentally or not so incidentally, these kids are fantastic at math when there is a right answer, because they feel some sense of reward from the effort process.
Yeah.
Now, the cool thing about dopamine is that it's very subjectively controlled. We can all learn to secrete dopamine in our brain in response to things that are in a purely subjective way.
Our interpretation.
But it has to be attached to reality. So, one should never confuse
what is real.
Right. So if you're thinking about the effort you're expending. So let's say somebody right now is financially back on their heels and they're setting up a new business, for instance, and it's hard. If they can take a few moments or minutes each day to reflect on the fact that the effort process is allowing them to climb out of their hole potentially, that it's giving them an opportunity, that it's somehow they are on the right path, or if they're not in movement along that path, or at least oriented on the right path, they're not lying in bed all day.
They're taking a step forward.
They're taking a step. If they can reward that process internally, two things happen. First of all, the brain circuits that are associated with building subjective rewards and dopamine get stronger, so you get better at that process. And second, and most importantly, dopamine has an amazing ability to buffer adrenaline and buffer epinephrine. And what I mean by that is, there was a study that was published in the journal Cell, excellent journal, Cell Press journal, a couple years ago, showing that with repeated bouts of effort, we use and we release more and more epinephrine. It's kind of adrenaline, but in the brain. Every time you put in effort, so every time you make, let's keep it, if I were to keep it in the business context, every time you write that email, every time let's see, it's a person who's a craftsman or a craftswoman, every time you're working in the shop and doing that, every bit of effort, you're taking a little bit of money out of this epinephrine account. You're spending epinephrine. At some point, those levels of epinephrine get high enough that you feel like quitting. It feels exhausting. And this was done in a beautiful study, actually, where they control the visual environments and they have the subjects exert effort, and they can control the visual environment. So sometimes the effort of taking steps and moving forward, this is actually kind of pushing forward and kind of swimming motion, would give them the sensation that they were actually making progress. And other times it was an exercise in futility, where they would just keep the visual world stationary and they would expend effort and they didn't think they were going anywhere.
My gosh.
Epinephrine's climbing, and eventually they quit. Now dopamine is able to push back on that epinephrine and give you anyone the feeling that you could continue, and maybe even the feeling that you want to continue. And you've seen this actually, like football is a good example. Two teams play, say the Super Bowl. Both teams are max effort the entire time.
Yeah.
Max effort. The team that wins suddenly, in a moment, has the energy to jump all over the place, party for days. They can talk. I mean, they
were
have
exhausted
energy.
right before
That's right.
then.
Well, that wasn't glycogen or stored energy of any kind, except it was neural energy. And what happened was, effort is this adrenaline. Eventually, people quit. They just quit. The dopamine is able to suppress that. And so then you're expending effort, but you're doing it from a place of feeling like you have energy for it.
So we need dopamine to keep the effort going. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
That's right. Dopamine is not just about reward. It's one of the biggest misconceptions. Dopamine is about motivation and drive. It's like a jet that propels you along a path.
So how do we get more dopamine?
You practice subjectively releasing dopamine in your mind.
Like how?
Okay, so that's a great question. First of all, there are ways you can get more dopamine release through thoughts or through drugs or through supplements. I want to be really clear. There is a drug, there are two drugs actually, that will cause massive release of dopamine. They're called cocaine and methamphetamine. The problem
That's what
is,
gets us addicted because it feels so good.
the problem is cocaine and methamphetamine stimulate so much dopamine release that the drug becomes the only source. It becomes the goal
Of
and
joy.
the path. It becomes the path and the destination. And you look at people's lives when they do a lot of cocaine and methamphetamine, and that baseline on their life goes down very,
Because there's
very
no
fast.
reason to work hard at anything else because you feel good.
That's right.
And that's the greatest feeling you'll have. So why do anything else when you can have that feeling?
That's right. And if you think about, remember these neurochemical systems, adrenaline, cortisol, dopamine, epinephrine, they weren't designed to keep us safe from tigers and to hunt and gather or to build Fortune 500 companies. They were designed to do anything. They were designed to be generic so that depending on our circumstances, we could adapt. So in an animal context, an animal that, let's say is hunting or it needs food for its young, it's gonna feel agitation, that's stress, that's cortisol. It's like hunger, my babies might not eat, I might not eat. Maybe it's looking for a mate. It's gonna feel agitation and start looking and roaming and searching. Foraging, as it's called in the animal behavior world. It's foraging. At some point, it might catch a smell of something, a potential mate or berries or a stream if it's thirsty. At that moment, dopamine is released, and now it has energy to continue along that path. Whereas there's a specific pathway in the brain that's involved in depression and disappointment, that if it goes to that place and it turns out it was the wrong path, there's a signal that actually suppresses dopamine so that you don't repeat that mistake again.
So you don't give up.
That's right.
You just don't repeat it again.
That's right. And those events that...
So it reminds you like that's not the path to go down.
That's right.
Interesting.
And we're sort of veering towards neuroplasticity here, which is the brain's ability to change itself in response to experience. Dopamine is one of the strongest triggers of neuroplasticity because it says those actions led to success previously. You're going to repeat those.
Go do those.
Those actions led to failure previously, and don't repeat those. So for every bit of pleasure that we get from pursuit and getting the thing that we were pursuing, the crash that comes afterwards feels painful. And all that we need to do in order to return to a baseline of dopamine, renew that resource, is to wait and make sure that we don't try and trigger yet more dopamine in that time. So you asked about, should I be taking caffeine in addition to training and blasting music? I always say people differ on this spectrum, but be careful about stacking dopamine. Training itself is a stimulus for dopamine release. Cold water is a stimulus for dopamine release. But if you start doing training, cold water, listening to your favorite music, plus you're taking, let's say, some stimulant, obviously the stimulants we've been talking about are terrible, but some of the stronger stimulants out there. Used to be ephedrine back when I was in college, but now people taking Adderall. Actually, you can tell if somebody has a lot of dopamine and adrenaline in their system just by looking at them. Their pupils are big. So somewhat paradoxically, when pupils are big, your visual aperture is narrow. That just has to do with the so-called accommodation of the eye, the optics of the eye. So remember, big pupils means somebody is high on their own dopamine and adrenaline. Could be drug induced, could be situational, etc. Small pupils are going to be a relaxed state. Now, of course, it's also going to be modulated by how bright it is in an environment because of the way these systems work. But when you can see somebody wide-eyed, well, dopamine and adrenaline also do something else. They actually trigger activation of the brainstem cranial nuclei that cause opening of the eyelids. They also cause an eyes up effect. When we get sleepy, what happens? Our eyes go down. When we're awake, eyelids are open and eyes are up. They might not be up like this. These relate to 3 different cranial nerve nuclei. For the future med students, you'll learn what these are. So it all makes perfect sense because nature is beautiful and the biology is laid out for us. But if we start stacking behaviors plus pharmacology plus mindsets that increase dopamine, great. But what that means is that if you get a really big dopamine increase, well, then that afternoon you might not feel the drive to do the work. You might think, why am I sleepy in the afternoon? Why am I kind of less motivated? Nowadays you hear, especially in Silicon Valley, about dopamine fasting. The people, I don't even want to look at somebody else's face. I'm not going to eat any, tasty food. I'm not going to do anything that stimulates dopamine. Sure, that will reset what you find pleasurable. But let's be realistic. The better way to do things would be to modulate dopamine release. Control it, make it work for you. And everyone's going to differ. So for some people, it's got to be music, the pre-workout, the 4 cups of espresso, and someone screaming in their face that they have to do it. Well, for other people, it will require fewer of those variables. But everyone needs to learn how they feel both before, during, and after a behavior. I think the right amount of exercise is what you can do consistently and train hard, but that also allow you to perform, unless you're an athlete and that's your profession, to be able to do the other things throughout the day that are beneficial to you. And of course, some people are training late in the day, and I have no problem with that. I got kind of attacked by the fitnessanistas recently, or whatever you call them online, because I said, training early in the day sets this dopamine pulse. Like, training late in the day has been shown in these 19 studies. Yeah. Sure, I'm sure for when your body temperature is elevated later in the day, lubrication of the joints and mental acuity, sure. But for most people who just need to get more movement and are trying to maximize focus and productivity throughout the day, early day training is going to be probably the better option. But sometime is better than no time. But if you're training late in the day and you're getting a big increase in body temperature and you're doing it under bright lights and you're drinking a pre-workout and you're wondering why you can't sleep at night, it's, you don't have to be Sigmund Freud or a neuroscientist to understand that you're basically just have your body, you're cranking your body temperature up. Hence a lot of these technologies, and here this isn't a promotion, we don't, at least not now, don't have a relationship to any of them. I won't even name them. There are a lot of technologies now about making your bed cool. This mat or this, to cool down your body temperature at night so you can sleep. So if you start thinking about this in kind of a rational structure, it makes sense. It also makes sense why, for instance, after a big win, sometimes we feel a crash and we need some time to reset. And that lower depression, sometimes people make the mistake of going out and pursuing more dopamine. One of the areas that I have real concern about, just because I hear about it so often and it wasn't an issue when I was growing up, is a lot of young guys in particular approach me because they're, based on the questions I'm getting, they're watching a lot of really intense pornography. And that has, we know, there are studies now going on at Stanford and elsewhere. Pornography, it creates a strong dopamine rush. These are very primitive pathways that in some ways can overwhelm the dopamine system. And then, another thing is happening. There's a lot of young guys are getting all this arousal from watching other people have sex. And then they're in the real world scenario and it's like, wait, you're no longer third personing this, you're actually in this scene. And it's completely collapsing them. And so I'm not one of these anti-porn people. I'm not here to judge. I'm just a scientist. I'm reporting I always say I'm not a doctor. I don't prescribe things. I'm a professor, so I profess things. You can decide what you want to do with it or not. But once you understand dopamine, that all makes perfect sense. They're getting this enormous dopamine release from something that is external to them, and real life, may not mimic the intensity of the combination of variables, right? Or people are exercising for a little while and it's all exciting to them, and they're taking tons and tons of pharmacology to do it, and then they kind of lose motivation. Well, remember, non-infinite yet renewable resource.
What's happening in the brain and body when we procrastinate?
So procrastination is super interesting. There are actually some data that Adam Grant shared with me recently that people who procrastinate actually have access to certain creative states that non-procrastinators don't, because they have
don't start justifying the procrastination crowd. That's a dangerous line to go.
Yeah, procrastination. I mean, what the origins of procrastination are complicated and varied. To really say a single concise statement as to what procrastination is, but the way to overcome procrastination is to do something harder than the hard thing that you're putting off. That's very clear. Do something harder. Don't go clean your, like suddenly people want to do their taxes, clean their room, clean the garage, organize the gym, whatever, when they don't want to write a chapter in their book. But you have to pick something that's worse than writing the chapter in your book and do that for 5 minutes. That's the way that the dopamine reward system works, and some of these stress systems work.
What would be an example? Give me a tactical example of this.
Okay, I need to write a chapter on focus and tools for focus for my book. I'm finding I'm doing everything but doing that. Let's just set it at kind of a fun example. I'll do anything but that. Okay, so then you have to find something worse than that. So for me, worse than that is anything involving a spreadsheet. Just the idea of a spreadsheet gives me hives. So I would force myself to do 5 to 10 minutes of like establishing a spreadsheet of my expenses and taxes related to, I don't know, some segment of my work life. I mean, I can't think of anything worse in that moment that doesn't involve physical or psychological damage. So doing that, and then you'll see it will make writing that book chapter very accessible. It's a downhill cruise from there. But people find themselves doing all these things that they would normally want to put off as a way to avoid doing the harder thing. So it's about understanding that what is difficult and what you want to put off or do is a dynamic hierarchy. I think you could think of it as dynamic subordination. I don't know if that's borrowed from cosplay or from military or BDSM. I don't know. I heard it someplace. Yeah. But
all the places that you mine for information most frequently.
No, it's raccoons and street fights. No, none of those communities are communities that I know very much about. But I was saying it facetiously. But the point being, do something harder than the thing you're trying to avoid. Now, some people really like deliberate cold exposure for that reason, because and here I'm going to really. If I've taken heat, for no pun intended, for the deliberate cold exposure thing, now I'm really going to get behind it for the following reason. People who are really into exercise of various kinds, but not deliberate cold exposure, love to push back on people that do posts about deliberate cold exposure. Oh, that's not doing anything. It's not much metabolic lift. Okay, but let's really step back and be honest with ourselves. The adrenaline, the pattern of adrenaline release over time from deliberate cold exposure is something that's very hard to recreate safely with other endeavors. Sure, a hard workout is going to spike your adrenaline and dopamine also, but is it going to spike it the way that deliberate cold exposure is? No. Also, the amount of a mental barrier that one has to get over in a moment, there's no like 3 warm-up sets, like walk on the treadmill.
0 to 100.
Pre-workout drink. Show me the pre-cold plunge drink that makes it easier. Okay? It's called willpower. Yeah. Okay. And now some people come to love deliberate cold exposure, but that's usually for how they feel afterwards. So I think there is so much utility to deliberate cold exposure. Now, do people have to do it? No, but deliberate cold shower, deliberate ice bath, deliberate cold plunge is a world apart from all the other self-imposed stressors because of the speed of onset of the stress.
It's even more so than a sauna.
That's right.
You get into a sauna and it takes time for you to heat up. It takes time for you to get uncomfortable.
Right. I mean, it's a very potent tool because of the amplitude and the timing of adrenaline that it creates. We tend to have different baseline levels of these neurotransmitters and how they work. Dopamine, I think some people are just more driven. Some people are more forward center of mass. Some people need to kick their own asses psychologically to become that. I mean, I know David Goggins reasonably well, about as well as anyone who doesn't know him well could, in the sense that he spends a lot of time with his partner. He's got his close circle. I'm not part of that close circle, but I've known David since, I met him in 2017, long before podcasts. He was on podcasts, I was on podcasts. He's always been the same. He's always been like super forward center of mass, like get after it. And by his own account, he had to take his 300 plus pound self and basically scruff himself and force himself to become this other person who's highly motivated because previously he wasn't. That's his report. So you can intervene in the self and become like that. I also think there is a very beautiful relationship between physical activity and psychological forward motion. When you are pushing into the morning, like, all right, get up. It's so tempting for many of us, myself included, like start scrolling in bed. Don't do it. Get out of bed. If you need more rest, do a non-sleep deep rest, go back to sleep, whatever. But then get out of bed, use the bathroom, get outside, drink some water, skip some rope, do some push-ups, swing your limbs, whatever. Get into forward center of mass. And then try and avoid passive activities that just waste your life. It's fun to get on Instagram and kind of answer a few things, but then like get out and go do something. Check in with friends in the morning. Like when you start doing these things that are physical forward center of mass, you start noticing you have more energy to do that, and then settling down and stopping becomes more challenging. Like when I went on Jocko's podcast, we went the first time 5.5 hours. He came on my podcast, 5 hours. The other day I did a podcast with Lane Norton, who's like the guy in nutrition and training. It's a ton of energy, and we went 6 hours. But you know, I'm basically, it might surprise you, I'm a pretty mellow guy. Drink a lot of caffeine, be alert. I sleep well at night. And you know, there's days when I feel lazy.
Yeah.
So am I an addictive personality? I don't know. But once I get fixated on something, I'm highly fixated. I have to remind myself to enjoy the process. Some people, again, I don't know what his inner landscape is like, but some people are more Ray Barbie about it, right? Carl Watson seems like a happy dude. I'm sure he has his down days, but there's some people that are always doing things. They're always kind of cheerful and going. Those are fun people to be around because it's very motivating to be around people who are motivated and are happy in the process. It's kind of annoying or difficult to be around people who are yeah, but, you know, you got to stop and smell the roses every once in a while, but sometimes the roses are forward movement. It's not about just basking in what you have. So, you know, it takes all forms. You know, we're a lot like dogs. Some dogs are like, and other dogs are like my dog, you know, my old bulldog. I'm probably gonna get another one soon. They just like chill. Just like, why move? You know, like it's great right here. You know, so I think know who you are, and then kind of, I would say it's wise. I think you can create a much better life for yourself and people close to you by being a little bit more forward center of mass around a few key pursuits, and around the rest of the stuff, just like chill. Like that's my advice. Other guys have lost a lot of weight, and women have lost a lot of weight the following way. I just give the following instruction. Just say, you can eat meat, fish, eggs, fruit, and vegetables. You're not going to eat bread, pasta, rice, tortillas, anything else. If it's not in that short list, water, coffee, or tea are fine. You're not eating it. Now that, you know, then people always start the negotiations. Like, well, can I have salsa? Okay, well, salsa's tomatoes. Yeah, I guess if it doesn't have sugar in it, okay, but how about just like eggs for breakfast and some fruit? How about a ribeye steak for dinner and a salad? Or 2 ribeye steaks. I don't care if you eat 2 ribeye steaks. Most people don't want 2 ribeye steaks. What you find is that people who've been eating a lot of processed foods and excess carbohydrates and fats together, when they switch to eating meat, fish, eggs, vegetables, and fruit, and nothing else, except of course drinking enough water, coffee. No, you're not drinking alcohol. No, you're not drinking milk, etc. What you find is they lose a lot of fat very, very quickly, very fast. Mostly because they bring their caloric intake down below what they need each day in terms of their activity. They're in a caloric deficit, as it's called, but they're very sated. Protein is very satiating. You have a ribeye steak, you don't really want a second, but you could have a second one and a salad and you're good. Then watch, you eat 1 bite of pasta or bread and all of a sudden you're hungry for more of that. And this has to do with the way that carbohydrates impact our appetite. I'm not demonizing carbohydrates. This is not a ketogenic diet. But what you find is, and Jacob will attest, that they lose 10 pounds in the first week. Some of that's water weight, but that gets them headed in the right direction. And then, of course, they should also walk if you can't do cardiovascular exercise like running or biking or skateboarding or whatever. They should walk a lot. Everyone should probably walk a lot, unless you're pushing a lot, skateboarding around a lot, or cycling a lot or something. Then they start exercising a little bit, and then they start doing some resistance training, and they start realizing, whoa, like this is quote unquote easy. And they're recovering from exercise, and they're sleeping better, and they're feeling better, and everything's better. Libido is better, mood is better. It's like, whoa. And they go like, how come everybody doesn't know about this? Well, it's not like a specific diet that you could market. I don't even know what you would call it. And again, I have nothing vested in this. There's no book about this, but there must be a dozen or more people that I've handed this idea off to directly that have lost, and again, anywhere from probably 20 to, in Mike's case, 60 pounds and kept it off for years. Now, Chris Ray did this recently. He was like, I want to get in shape. I'm feeling kind of heavy. So Chris is a naturally strong guy. He's got thick joints. He's got a lot of natural muscle build there. So he immediately started going to the gym as well. But when we were in Australia on tour, I was like, here's what you can eat. And I told him those food groups. That guy lost like 30 pounds in 2 months. He also lifts. We have to like restrict his lifting because he'll go to the gym like twice a day, every day. This is a guy where if you have an appointment to start filming at 9 a.m., he's there at 6, like waiting outside. You're like,
by the way, phenomenal skateboard.
Yeah, he's won all sorts of awards.
He's the best.
Yeah, and he wins the award of just being an awesome filmer, an amazing guy.
He's great.
And he was over this morning doing the sauna and cold plunge. When he's in, he's all in.
Yeah.
But he started eating this way too. And then he has an interesting story that he told me I could share, where one day he decided to cheat. So he had all this like pizza and ice cream and he just threw it up. And it kind of tasted, some people, like Jacob has told me, when he's like, oh, I really miss, after he lost a bunch of weight, he's like, I really miss whatever it was. I don't know, sandwiches. He likes hoagies and stuff like that. I've known Jacob since we were kids. So, and he's always liked snack foods. So I was like, go for it, try it. And he did it and he was like, ugh. It tasted terrible. And I'm like, exactly. First bite feels okay. And then you're craving it, but you don't actually want that. It's some brain thing that we don't quite yet understand. And when you start eating clean in that way, of the meat, fish, fruits, vegetables kind of thing, you start to develop a really nice relationship between taste, calories, satiety, and nutrients. And you're eating high nutrient food, meat, fruit, and vegetables, super high nutrient food. And he's like, it's just transformed his life. And I don't take credit for this. This is well known for ages. It's just that people are always like, oh, I'm going to do this diet, or I'm going to do that diet, or what supplement should I take? It's like the supplement you should take is stop eating processed foods and highly processed foods, start moving more, start eating really great quality protein and fruits and vegetables, and you're going to feel like $1 million. And there it is. And he probably is putting years on his life now. And so the discussion around longevity and all this stuff, it's like, sure, there's stuff. We could talk about NMN, and we could talk about PRP, and we could talk about Brian Johnson and all the stuff he's doing to live forever. And, but if you do the right things consistently, like 80% of the time, you are going to get an outsized positive benefits. Yeah, so you need a stance, like a life stance. And for me, it's, I have very close friends and family, people that I love, and that love me. So that's like, the circle is really small.
That foundation is real.
Yeah, that foundation is real, right? Mm-hmm. And so I'm very blessed to have that. And I've worked hard at it. And I put a lot of work into it. I check in with people in the morning. I do it out of love. I like to think they do it out of love for me. So my foundation is that, right? It's not the podcast. I love the podcast. I love my work. But I have that people that really know me, that I feel safety and acceptance with. And that I hope that they feel safe and accepted with me. That's the key. Mm-hmm. You don't need many of those people, but you need a few. And if you don't have them, you need to put some work into building them.
Those few are really going to tell you how it is.
Yes. Yeah. How it is, and I just can rely on them. I've got people that I love, and I love them. I've got things that I love doing. Like getting that morning sunlight for me is more about, just touching in with life. I think like anybody, my mind can start drifting into the past, things that have happened, good and bad. I can start future tripping. It's about getting like really present. We have the unit of the day, leaning into that. Some of the best advice I ever got recently was, wake up and just think, what can I do to make today a little bit better for me and for the people around me and for the world? Just that. That's probably the best advice I've ever gotten. Because it's not about comparing yourself to yesterday or these little mantras. It's like, what can I do to make today better? Mm-hmm. For me, for the people around me, for the world.
Right.
If it's pick up a piece of trash, I know people are like, oh God, this guy sounds like a grade school dude. No, actually, a little better. You can do those things. And there are a lot of other things you can do. Okay, so there's that core. Then there's the work, and the fact that the work is public facing. And I do believe, because it's zero cost, because it's science-based, and because 90% of what I talk about are do's and don'ts that are behaviors. You don't have to purchase anything to do them. It's a give. It's my offering.
Right.
And people have agency. They don't have to listen to it, let alone do the stuff, right? They don't have to listen. If I'm popping up in your feed anyway, like, don't blame me, you know? But
The algorithm's working.
yeah, exactly. The algorithm. You know, and it is zero cost. And people will say, well, but the ads are intrusive. If you have thumbs, or even if you don't, you scan past them. It's okay. You know, that makes it zero cost to people. Now, the supplement piece, cold plunges, that stuff tends to become the focus. People are like, he's the cold plunge supplement guy. It's all about selling this or that. And look, that we run advertisements so it can be zero cost to people. I do only advertise things that I truly love and use. It's about self-motivation. Do you have any suggestions or steps to self-motivate to start a new routine? I do. First of all, be very careful who you announce and what you announce to people in terms of starting a new routine, unless they are going to really be on you about accountability. In general, talking to people about our goals, less effective, in my opinion, and there's some research to support this, than just simply making the decision, writing it down, simple, you know, old school like me, 8.5 by 11 paper, write down what the goal is, give yourself a check for each day that you do it or the times of day that you do it. Sometimes signing your signature as if you have a contract with yourself can help. These are all different tricks. Some people will say, should you reward yourself for completing something? Sure. Should you scare yourself into doing something? Sure. There's data to support that also. I covered this in the episode with Emily Balchetis and about goal seeking and habits that I did as solo episodes. We have a newsletter on this. Here's the deal. There are going to be multiple barriers to starting a new routine. I do believe in incremental approaches to these things. Right now, I'm working on some bonus chapters of my book. And while I'm pretty motivated person, I'm excited to share that information with the world. I must say that setting aside time to do these bonus chapters has been challenging because I've got a lot else going on. So rather than tell people that I'm doing that, I actually have a contract with myself that I sign each time I complete anywhere from a 10 to 60 minute writing block. So a contract with yourself can really help. I think it's far more valuable than stating to the world what you're going to do. I don't know why that tends to work, but we know why stating to the world what you're going to do often wears off, because typically, and this reflects both good and bad things about human behavior and psychology, typically people will support you by saying, great, you're going to do great, the book's going to be great, or your new exercise program is going to be great, you're going to do, and they're just supporting you. And that support turns out to be sufficient to create this mindset like that you could do it at any point, or you've got the support you need. Sometimes a little bit of additional friction, what Tim Ferriss would call fear setting, is a good idea. You think about worst outcomes if you don't do the thing. But let's face it, you can't lie to yourself and believe it. So if you know that not doing the thing isn't going to markedly change your life for the worse, well, in that case, you need some additional support. You need some additional motivation. So you could use all sorts of tools and protocols like a cold shower to increase epinephrine, adrenaline, and dopamine and get more motivated and then do something. You could, and I think this is probably the best tool anyone could apply, which would be to put away your phone, turn it off, put it in the other room. I now have a box for my phone that I've dedicated to keeping my phone in when I'm busy doing other types of work, for which the presence of the phone would be an intrusion. It would limit my work output. I do think that the contract with self is going to be the best way. You say, I am going to do 30 minutes of whatever, resistance training 3 times a week, and then you're going to sign off by the end of the week. And when you complete each one, that's your reward to yourself, that you were accountable. There's no external reward. Why do I say this? The work itself should become the reward. We know this from all the work on growth mindset that we've talked about, Carol Dweck's wonderful work and David Yeager's wonderful work. He was a guest on the podcast. I've done solo episodes about their work about growth mindset, that ultimately the work becoming the reward is how you're going to sustain motivation over time. So when you sign off that you did the work and that's the reward, well, then there's this kind of cyclical relationship between what you've promised yourself you would do, what you did, and rewarding yourself for the work. No additional external reward. The work becomes the reward. So I like the idea of being a bit of a what we would call closed loop system on motivation rather than going out and seeking excessive support from others. And I say this not to isolate, I encourage healthy relationships, etc. But if we start seeking external validation or pressure in order to do what we know we want to do or would love to be able to do without external support, we limit ourselves. And when that support isn't there, we tend to be far less productive and move toward our goals far less well. So it's an internal process of reshaping your psychology. There's also some deeper psychology around this stuff of, agency and what you feel you deserve. You deserve, I'll tell you this because I believe everyone deserves to be able to better themselves through these kinds of self-directed actions. And I also like the idea of a closed loop because you can be really honest with yourself at the end of a week. Did you do your 3 sessions? Did you sign off 3 times? Keeping some of that reward system and validation internal really helps you become stronger also to be able to support other people if they need your support. Whereas if you have a committee of people that you rely on, that you need to hear from, you need their support in order to be motivated. While that can be great, coaches can be great and support systems are wonderful, I don't think it's nearly as effective as being your own committee. Your own chair and secretary in this case, and member of your own committee. And then of course, seek social support and reinforcement for other areas of your life that you need, and be a source of social support, but also encourage people to be in this kind of cyclical loop of motivation and to really impart the principles of growth mindset, which is really what we're talking about. Make the effort the reward. How you think about stress impacts the stress response in profound ways. So this paper, Rethinking Stress, the Role of Mindsets in Determining Stress, did a very simple set of manipulations. They had people in one group listen to a lecture that effectively was titled, quote, "The effects of stress are negative and should be avoided." And that lecture included information about how stress diminishes performance and how it can diminish health and vitality, learning and performance, productivity, it increases uncertainty, etc. Okay, and all of that information is true. A separate group listened to a lecture entitled, quote, "Experiencing stress improves health and vitality." And again, that information is true. Now, I realize that some of you are probably still asking, how can it be that stress diminishes health and performance and stress also enhances health and performance? And the answer lies in 2 things. 1, the level of stress, and therefore the level of hormones that are released in response to that stress, the duration over which the stress response occurs. But the key variable here is that our cognitive understanding about what stress does impacts whether or not our physiology goes down the direction of debilitating or enhancing effects of stress. Okay, so we've got a condition here where people are being informed very differently about what stress does. In one case, it's the stress is bad message. In the other case, it's the stress is good message. And there are many different experiments within this paper, but one of the more interesting ones, I believe, is where they looked at work performance, both in terms of performance of what they call soft tasks. So these are somewhat easier tasks as well as hard tasks. And when you look at the group that was given information about how stress diminishes performance in the soft tasks, okay, so the somewhat easy tasks, you don't see much change in their performance as you compare the before the learning about stress is diminishing to after the learning. Whereas the people who learn that stress is enhancing actually experience some improvement in work performance, even though the challenge that they're facing isn't that great. So again, what this means is that learning that stress can enhance performance by providing people true information about how stress can enhance performance, can increase performance even in the context of stuff that's not that hard, not that stressful. Even more interesting is that when you look at performance on tasks that are considered hard and you compare the stress is diminishing group, meaning the group that was taught that stress is diminishing, and compare that to the stress is enhancing group, you see a really divergent response. The people that learn that stress diminishes performance did not improve at all, whereas the people that learn that stress can enhance performance enhance their performance significantly. Now keep in mind, all they are doing is learning that stress can enhance their performance, and then they're given a task and they're performing better. So that's pretty spectacular, right? There's no training session that they went and did. They didn't practice these items that they were being tested on in between. They weren't given a bunch of, drills to do, and they didn't take a lot of time to do it. They just heard a tutorial about how stress can enhance performance. And that, I believe, is remarkable, because what it says is that our cognitive appraisal about stress, which we all are going to experience in life, right? Elevated heart rate, narrowing of visual focus, shifting of blood away from the periphery. All of these things are characteristic features of the stress response that we learn, especially in this day and age, because it's talked about a lot in popular culture, that, all of these mechanisms were put into us in order for us to get away from the saber-toothed tiger or the lion that's trying to eat us. Let's be fair. The stress response is there for a lot of reasons, not just because of saber-toothed tigers and lions. I mean, that's kind of a story that we make up. The stress response is inherent not just to us, but to other species as a way to mobilize us either away from things or toward things, right? We need to have somewhat of a stress response in order to engage in adaptive challenge. Yes, it's true that hundreds and thousands of years ago, those adaptive challenges probably involved hunting, but they probably involved social challenges as well. Do you think it was easy for cavemen and women to engage socially and, kind of settle out their romantic interactions, et cetera? Do you think it was easy for them to raise children? No, of course not. The stress response is there for a variety of reasons, not just to get away from predators. The really exciting thing that's been discovered in the course of Ali Crumb's work and other work in the last couple of decades is that the stress response is neither good nor bad. The stress response depends on whether or not you believe the sensations that you're experiencing, elevated heart rate, narrowing of visual focus, etc., are serving to enhance your performance or diminish your performance. And this study really points to the fact that just learning that it can enhance performance. Now, I know a number of you are probably saying, wait, but stress doesn't feel good, right? And oftentimes we experience stress under conditions where we're trying to learn or get good at something or listen better or do something, and it actually is diminishing performance. And I think it's important to acknowledge that. This study and studies like it are not saying that stress becomes pleasant as a sensation in the body, nor is it saying that it always leads to improved performance. I don't want you to think that's the take-home message. Sometimes it does, it can, as was demonstrated in this research paper, but oftentimes, as we know, stress diminishes our performance. It takes us away from the landmarks we want to hit. It takes us away from the grades we want to get. It takes us away from, quote unquote, showing up how we want to, right? No one wants to have the blotchy skin and the sweating and the quaking of voice when we're trying to do public speaking and things of that sort. No one wants any of that. What's important to understand is that learning that stress is a way of mobilizing resources in the body does two things. First of all, it allows us to dampen or adjust the stress response in real time. And it allows us to understand that that stress response heightens our level of focus in a way that allows us to pay attention to the things that are going wrong in a way that allows us to make correction to those errors in the future. So if you think back to that study, that ERP study where they measured brain activity and they looked at people who had a fixed mindset versus people who had a growth mindset, and the people who had a growth mindset were paying more cognitive attention to what was happening during errors and after errors. Well, this stress is enhancing mindset is very powerful because what it does is it shifts one's attention away from kind of somatic experience of, oh my goodness, my heart rate is elevated, I'm sweating, I'm quaking, I sound terrible, I feel terrible, I look terrible, etc., to a mode of allocating more of our thinking toward analyzing why things might be going wrong. And something else powerful happens when we embrace a stress is enhancing mindset as well. When we embrace a stress is enhancing mindset, it turns out that some of the very physiological processes that we call quote unquote stress shift in important ways. Some of those include the duration over which the stress hormone cortisol is released. And in fact, I don't even really want to call it a stress hormone because cortisol does so many other things as well. And it's not bad. You need cortisol. Believe me, you want cortisol, especially released early in the day and in response to acute stressors. What you don't want is for cortisol to stay elevated for long, long periods of time. And you especially don't want it to interfere with your sleep. Okay, so much so that I think at times I wonder whether or not our philosophy on stress should be that stress is fantastic for us, except when it interferes with our sleep, right? And when stress becomes terrible for us is when it starts to be chronically elevated, and especially when it starts to inhibit our ability to sleep well enough and long enough. Okay, so the point here is that when we embrace a stress is enhancing mindset, we are able to have shorter duration release of cortisol. We are also able to engage what's called increased stroke volume under conditions of stress. This gets a little bit technical, but the amount of blood that your heart can pump with each beat turns out to be a key metric of stress. When we are very stressed, even though we need to mobilize a lot of resources, somewhat paradoxically, our total stroke volume can actually be reduced, and we tend to shuttle blood and other resources towards the core of our body and towards major limbs and away from things like our brain and our periphery. So one of the key measures of how a stress response, quote unquote, is going is how much peripheral blood flow there is. And when we are more relaxed under conditions of stress, there tends to be more peripheral blood flow. When we are more anxious, more panicked under conditions of stress, peripheral blood flow is lower. And in a remarkable set of experiments, Ali Crum and colleagues have shown that when we are just taught that stress can be enhancing, and then we are placed into a stressful environment, either because we are imagining stress or we are experiencing real stress, and then our physiology is measured, what is observed is that the total amount of blood that the heart can pump with each beat is actually increased. Peripheral blood flow increases, and our ability to maintain cognition, to think clearly under conditions of stress, increases. And again, the only manipulation here is a tutorial about how stress can be enhancing, which is essentially what I'm telling you right now. The testosterone molecule and the dopamine molecule bear a very close relationship. So if somebody pushes really hard, wins, yes, that will increase testosterone. Winning increases testosterone. Losing decreases testosterone in all venues. Yeah. So they've looked at this with day traders. You win, more money, they get more testosterone. Losing, okay, now here's the interesting thing. I had an episode of the podcast with the great Robert Sapolsky, who wrote Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, The Trouble with Testosterone, etc. Let's talk about the effects of testosterone and DHT in the brain. The main effect of these androgens in the brain is to make effort feel good. Because of the way that testosterone and DHT bind to receptors and activate certain components of the amygdala. We always think of the amygdala as a fear center, but it's a threat detection center, and it has a lot of different parts, including parts that allow you to be forward center of mass in response to pressure. So, am I suggesting people take exogenous testosterone? No, that's a personal choice that people can explore on their own if they want to do that. But if you've been pushing, and winning, or just pushing really hard and then you've experienced that crash, a lot of people need some time to recover in order to be able to come back and be able to work hard again. But here's what's really interesting. Not only does testosterone make effort feel good, effort increases testosterone. So this is the athlete or the student who's like, I don't want to do it, I don't want to do anything. Getting into some degree of forward center of mass. I always say, I think I picked this up from a team guy, it's very team guy language. You can either be back on your heels, flat-footed, or forward center of mass on anything. Getting into that forward center of mass mental orientation can start to trigger some of the pathways related to these hormones and these neuromodulators. What you don't want to do is start using a lot of exogenous factors, caffeine, or a lot of things outside of you in order to try and create those states, because then you're going to further deplete your dopamine and so on. When I think you went on Rogan at one point, and I listened to a portion of the conversation where you said you had been working really hard, and then you went on vacation, and then you got sick.
Yeah.
So this is interesting. That's the autonomic nervous system.
That's happened to me like numerous times.
Okay, so there's a very clear explanation for that and a very simple remedy, although it's not obvious, which is why many people experience this. Many people experience studying for finals, and then it ends getting sick. Taking care of a loved one, round the clock. The person either gets better or sometimes dies or whatever it is, and then the caretaker gets sick. Why is that? Well, we always hear that stress compromises the immune system. Nothing could be further from the truth. Stress activates the immune system. Think about it. How would your immune system, your spleen, and your other immune organs of the body know when it's under pressure? Well, you could have some foreign bacteria or virus in your body, but when you are in a mode of go, the molecule adrenaline triggers the release of killer B cells and T cells from the spleen. It's when you relax. Now you need to get your sleep, but it's when you finally experience that symmetric swing back of the seesaw. So you're go, boom. And then you completely relax and you're hanging out, and all of a sudden you get the sniffle and the rest of the thing. There's a beautiful study that was done in response to none other than Wim Hof, believe it or not. There's a really beautiful quality scientific study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences where they had two groups of people. One group meditated, the other group did Wim Hof type breathing. So what we call in the laboratory cyclic hyperventilation. So inhale, exhale 25 times. Forceful inhales and forceful exhales. Then hold your breath, lungs empty for 15 seconds, repeat for about 3 rounds. What does that do? Why do you heat up? Adrenaline. It's such a generic thing. It's adrenaline. You could have gotten into an ice bath. Adrenaline. You could have someone shout in your face. Adrenaline. It's just adrenaline. What did they do? They injected both groups of people with E. coli. Injected them with E. coli. One group gets nauseous, vomiting, and feels sick. The group that does this cyclic hyperventilation, Wim Hof, also called Tumo type breathing, far fewer symptoms, if any, including lack of fever. So why? Well, they were able to combat the attack of this bacteria. So if you're coming off of a hard bout of work and you're starting to relax into vacation, you would be wise to still get into some cold water. You would be wise to still do some cyclic hyperventilation breathing. Certainly don't do those at the same time. A number of people actually have died doing cyclic hyperventilation and then doing breath holds, because when you exhale a lot of carbon dioxide is the trigger to breathe. This is really important. If you do hyperventilation and then you hold your breath, you can do a much longer breath hold than you could if you just started off without having done that. Why? That you don't take breaths because of a need for oxygen, although you do need that. You take breaths because of a buildup of carbon dioxide triggers these brainstem neurons, which have you do the gasp reflex. Okay, well, if you dump all your carbon dioxide and you're not a skilled free diver, like Mark Healy or somebody like that who really understands that, what happens is you're swimming along, you're like, wow, I can really hold my breath down here a long time. Lights out. Actually, I'm aware of a few people in the military community who've dabbled with Wim Hof Tumo type breathing and have died, and it's not good. I think it's not allowed, basically. It's not certainly not encouraged from what I understand. So do it on land away from water. And the idea here is that adrenaline protects us. You don't want it cascading out of control so that you can't sleep. You want to use things like non-sleep deep rest and the appropriate timing of light and exercise, et cetera, to be able to sleep well at night, to reset all these systems. But if you go too quickly from go, 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 go to complete relaxation, your immune system, your defense system will crash too. And so you're not gonna be able to fight off even the smallest or the pettiest of viruses and bacteria. That's when you get the sniffle, you get sick. You're like, I'm finally resting, what's going on? So you can taper out of those high intensity phases. There are actually, guys in the teams now that I think are aware of this and are starting to think about this and for various effects. But in the mind, testosterone makes effort feel good. Adrenaline puts us into a mode of readiness. Dopamine puts us into a mode of motivation. And then there's the mirror side of all this, which are the neurochemicals that broadly defined promote relaxation and parasympathetic activation. And those come under the names that you've probably heard them before, like serotonin, oxytocin, and the hormone prolactin. Serotonin and oxytocin are molecules that make us feel good, make us feel soothed, not in response to things that we're motivated to go get, but in response to what we already have. So this might sound a little woo, but if you sit there and do a gratitude practice, or you hang out with your dog and your kids, or you eat a meal, right? You're nourishing yourself with food that you are not in the process of having to kill first. You're just really in, Thanksgiving, a few moments of appreciation, simple things. The feel good that you experience, the love and kindness meditations, these kinds of things, we know, based on neuroimaging studies and blood draws and things of that sort, promote the release of things like serotonin and oxytocin. That nature has designed beautiful systems of pursuit and pleasure that are designed to oscillate and designed to keep us in pursuit and pleasure cycles. In relationships, typically the dopamine phase is the early phase.
Simultaneously in these cycles?
Oftentimes not simultaneously. Typically dopamine and serotonin are released. There's always some floating around in our system at any moment, but typically dopamine and adrenaline are associated with pursuit of things that are outside the confines of our immediate possession in our skin, and serotonin is more about the things that we have, the things, seeing your kid, holding your kid, that promotes the release of oxytocin and serotonin. It feels amazing, right? These are the molecules that led to our evolution as a species. So I'm not diminishing one or the other, but they need to oscillate, right? An early relationship, there are times when people aren't sleeping very much. It's like a mental illness. It's a form of mania. You're so excited, you don't need sleep, right? People are able to do all sorts of things at frequency and intensity that they find themselves 2 years later in a relationship, and they love the person. It's very warm and cozy, but well, unless they're going off on deployments and coming back, they don't have that reset of the system. So, the ability to miss somebody, reset that pursuit and desire system. These are powerful systems, and they don't just pertain to romantic relationships. This is also school. I always did summer school because I had to do a lot of catching up to do based on a lot of catching up. But, there's some value in taking a week off and realizing you are truly resetting all the systems for pursuit. And I hear from a lot of hard driving folks who are like, wow, once I understood dopamine, I realized why I'm so burnt out. People think of adrenal burnout. Guess what? There's no actual medical term, adrenal burnout. There's adrenal insufficiency syndrome. That's a rare syndrome, but you have enough adrenaline packed away in your brain and body for 3 lifetimes. Think about what people used to go through. I mean, you talk about some of this on your podcast. You see the images of people and you read the stories. You're like, you can make it through finals, kids. So what happens though is we're in such modes of pursuit and overthinking. We need to learn how to switch back and forth on a regular basis, what I call deliberate decompression or non-sleep deep rest. Have a practice each day of 10 to 30 minutes where you're not on your phone and you're in kind of a wordless state. You're just either yoga nidra or you're just relaxing or not watching anything, not taking in any sensory information, not meditating, not journaling, just in a state of just trying to blank your mind, and just watch how much stronger you come back in terms of your ability to focus and your motivation. That's one. I love the phone, and social media has been very good to me, and I appreciate many of its features. But one of the problems is we tend to fill our idle time with more sensory information, and that doesn't allow us to go into this deliberate decompression. It doesn't allow us to. You remember, I cut myself off, but a picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, a movie is worth 1,000,000 pictures. Now I can scroll through millions of movies very quickly. And so the dopamine system is just a little bit overwhelmed. I don't think we need to be off our phones all the time. We just take some time to just deliberately decompress each day, any time of day, and you'll focus better.
So you're getting hit with that dopamine on Instagram.
So at first you are, but here's how you know dopamine, and this will give you a window into addiction. If you're not an addict, you'll be able to sympathize with, maybe even empathize with addicts of various kinds. When you first get on social media, you're excited. Maybe you or Joe or somebody has a new podcast out, right? You're excited. Oh, I can't wait to hear this. That's dopamine. You're motivated. But if you ever find yourself doing a behavior and you kind of don't know why you're doing it, like this doesn't feel any good anymore. It's like that, what is that it's a funny story there because of the new stuff, but that Chris Rock thing where he's talking about when you're shanking somebody and your heart's just not in it, like that, he does this funny thing, right? I think it was him. You're sort of like that, like, hey, your heart's not in. Like, why am I here? What am I doing? I'm not even getting any pleasure, but here I am, like a rat pressing a lever. Well, that's, the dopamine system has been depleted. And so what you need is some time away from it. Could be 10 minutes, could be 10 days. And then it feels good again. True for relationships, true for exercise. I believe in training hard and training often, but if you train too hard, too often, you can't bring the intensity that you need to get the stimulus to adapt, and pretty soon you're either plateauing or you're getting worse. Okay, so the anterior mid-cingulate cortex, for those of you that may not have seen the episode on willpower and tenacity, but even if you have, is a region of the brain that is involved in leaning into difficult challenges of all kinds. This is an area of the brain that gets larger when we embrace effort that leads to a bit of internal anxiety, but it's something that's good for us, an adaptive thing. And this is an area of the brain that gets smaller when we don't engage in challenging endeavors. Now, we need to define challenging endeavors very specifically. Challenging endeavors that stimulate the growth of the anterior mid-cingulate cortex are challenging endeavors that we would prefer not to do. We may want the end goal, right? So we may want the consequence of the exercise, the consequence of the learning, the consequence of whatever the challenge is, but that the challenge itself feels uncomfortable. And here, of course, we want it to be uncomfortable but safe challenges is what's going to grow the anterior mid-cingulate cortex. Now, another thing about the anterior mid-cingulate cortex that's important is that for people that end up being successful dieters, successful pursuit of fitness, for people that complete a degree or finish an exam or things of that sort, the anterior mid-cingulate cortex gets bigger. For people that fail to do the work required to prepare, so the preparation, that is, the anterior mid-cingulate cortex actually shows a bit of atrophy. So the anterior mid-cingulate cortex is an anatomical and neural reflection of willpower and tenacity. And I think what people get wrong over and over about these sorts of findings is that the anterior mid-cingulate cortex is really responding to a variety of inputs, as a lot of different inputs and outputs. We know that based on neural circuit tracing, but it absolutely responds best to things that feel like that they are indeed difficult, that they are a challenge. So if you're like me and you enjoy certain forms of exercise and it's just pure bliss for you the whole way through, that's not going to grow your anterior mid-cingulate cortex. However, if you add a bit of, let's say, higher intensity work, I like doing a long run or hike on Sundays. I don't do sprints too often at the end of that. But if I were to do a couple hill sprints at the end and I really was like, this is rough, this sucks, that's actually the sort of thing that's going to stimulate the anterior mid-cingulate cortex. The anterior mid-cingulate cortex, since Carolyn, you asked about studies, was actually discovered in cases where people were stimulating this brain area, and the subjects, these were people receiving neurosurgery for other reasons, reported feeling like something was impending, not impending doom, but there was some challenge, like they were going to head into a storm, something challenging was coming. But the other subjective feeling that they reported was feeling like they could lean into it, like they're ready for it, they were ready to meet that challenge. So what you're looking for when you are interested in growing your anterior mid-cingulate cortex, and I'll tell you why that's a good thing to do, is you're looking for that feeling of leaning into challenge, that friction. If something's too easy or it's too delightful, it's not going to contribute to your anterior mid-cingulate cortex function and growth. It might contribute to other things, indeed it will, and life isn't all about leaning into challenge, but why would you want to stimulate your anterior mid-cingulate cortex in this way? And by the way, those challenges can come from physical endeavors, it can come from language learning, it can come from a hard conversation that you've been putting off that's hard for you to have. Lord knows we all have those aspects of our lives, the things that we're putting off or that are hard for us or that feel difficult. Again, keep these endeavors safe. Never want to do anything that would damage your mental health or physical health, but leaning into challenge in that way does seem to activate and grow the anterior mid-cingulate cortex. Now, the advantages of that is that there are studies, showing that the so-called superagers, I don't like that name so much. It's a bit of a misnomer. They call them superagers, but they really should be called super non-agers, because these are people who seem to maintain healthy cognitive function much longer than most individuals. Their memory, their IQ remains stable into their much, much later decades of their life, or even improves over time. And then the correlation, and again, this is correlation, but these people's anterior mid-cingulate cortex does not atrophy. And in general, what the studies point to, and there still needs to be more data collected on this, is that these people are regularly engaging in things that are hard for them and challenging, and they've embraced that challenge. So lots to say about anterior mid-cingulate cortex, but I think that grabs the top contour. And I'm a big fan of trying to do something difficult, at least one thing, ideally every week, and perhaps even every day, a little bit. It doesn't take much, maybe even just 5 minutes. It's that friction, that feeling of, I don't want to do this, I can't do this, and then continuing to practice or continuing to lean into that challenge safely, of course, that is going to grow that anterior mid-cingulate cortex. And I just think that's amazing, right? We hear so much about brain atrophy and memory loss and et cetera, as we get older. A lot of data now about how to preserve healthy physical function. Here we're really talking about how to maintain healthy cognitive function, and the anterior mid-cingulate cortex seems to be a barometer of how well we are doing that. I'd love to hear more about an evening routine and not just morning, especially when it comes to light. Ooh, I love this question. I love this question because I've made a lot of changes in the last year related to this, because there's this guy on the internet that talks about the importance of getting morning sunlight. Just kidding. There are several of us, and gals, but I suppose I've been quite vocal about the importance of getting morning sunlight as soon as possible after waking. And of course, unless you have powers I'm not aware of, if you wake up before the sun comes out, people always ask, what do I do? You wait till the sun comes out. If it's overcast, you get outside a bit longer. If you want to wake up before the sun comes out, turn on bright artificial lights. Now, these days I've actually been playing around a little bit with some bright artificial lights because I tend to wake up before the sun is out. It's the winter months. But in any case, I've talked a lot about the morning routine in the early part of the day and a bit about the afternoon part of the day. Evening routine. Okay, well, I'll tell you ideal, and then I'll tell you what I do. I'm always shooting for ideal, but I'm human. I think there's this idea on the internet that I've seen that my whole life is protocol. And indeed, sometimes it looks like that, and indeed, sometimes it doesn't. I'm human. Things happen. We all encounter different challenges. So to answer your question directly, Mark, I know it's very important that, if possible, that you get a little splash of sunlight in your eyes in the afternoon and evening. Why? Why is that important? And what we're really talking about here is not necessarily seeing a sunset at the beach, although that would be great if you could do that, but getting some sunlight in your eyes before the sun goes down, maybe for 5-10 minutes. It's not as important as the morning sunlight, but it does have a great benefit. And the benefit is it adjusts the sensitivity of the neurons in your retina and in your brain such that it protects you against brighter artificial lights later in the evening. Now, it doesn't protect you completely, but what it does is, if normally, and this is true, bright light viewed for 15 seconds or more between the hours of 10 p.m. and 4 a.m. I'm talking about somebody on a standard schedule, not shift worker. Bright lights viewed for 15 seconds or more between the hours of 10 p.m. and 4 a.m. can dramatically quash melatonin levels. Melatonin being the hormone that's involved in feeling sleepy and falling asleep. It does other things as well. Of course, it's secreted from the pineal. We know, based on a really nice study published in Science Reports, that if you view that afternoon, late afternoon, evening sunlight, you don't have to be too strict about the time. Pop your sunglasses off as long as you can do that safely. Get some sunlight in your eyes, or if you can't look directly at the sun, and by the way, never stare directly at the sun, at least getting some daylight in your eyes before the sun goes down. That can offset that melatonin reduction by about 50%, which is pretty impressive. Now, you would still do well to dim the lights in the evening. And one thing that I've been playing with recently is using red lights. So a lot of people, when they hear red lights, they think, oh, you're talking about red light panel, which that has its uses. Those tend to be very bright red lights. Or portable red light. I actually use a small portable red light. It looks like a thick piece of toast. I use that for other reasons. This is not what we're talking about with evening routine. With evening routine, it can be beneficial and very, very cost effective to get some red bulbs and put them in, say, the bedroom where you read before you go to sleep, or in a particular room in your house that you tend to spend time in the evening. It makes for a nice mellow feel, but it also does several other things. First of all, if they're the correct red bulbs, and I'll mention the ones that I've been using in a moment, they eliminate all the blue wavelengths that tend to be stimulating for what we call the noradrenergic system. So adrenaline, noradrenaline, cortisol, etc. Indeed, there's a study that shows that when shift workers who have to be up at night use red lights of the type that I'm describing, when they work under red light, they have less of a cortisol increase than were they to work under standard fluorescent lights or even standard LED lights. So number one thing would be dim the lights in the evening and at night as much as you safely can to perform whatever functions you need. Don't fall, don't burn yourself at the stove. If you have to write and do work, as I often do, you need light. But to the extent that you can shift to red lights, that can be helpful. And many people, and myself included, find that you get sleepier when you do that. So I might just do this for the last hour of the evening, even if I'm up till 10 or 11. Or if I do it earlier, then I tend to get really sleepy. But those red lights, I have a little lamp above my bed. I'll do that if I'm going to read in bed. I make it much easier to fall asleep, probably because of the reduced cortisol associated with eliminating the blue wavelengths, and they tend to be fairly dim. And now there's one brand of red light that that actually will work on a dimmer. So this is important. I suppose you could use red party lights or Christmas lights. Those could be very affordable. Some people do that, but it's kind of festive feel in the room. Other people, like myself, will use a red light that's dimmable. I want to mention that what I'm about to say, I don't have any financial relationship to this company in terms of the bulbs. Red light panels are different. I use the Juve. I use Juve type, but for red lights that, for the purpose I'm talking about, that would go into a standard lamp and that you dim, where has a very different purpose, right? The red light panels have a very different purpose than red bulbs that you would put into a standard light fixture. The dimmable ones are called, you can find them as red light, you just put BON. It's the technical name of the company is, sorry, forgive me for Googling this now. Yeah, it's a BON charge, B-O-N, separate word charge. And those are dimmable and they have the proper wavelength. So that's what I use. They're not super cheap, but they're not expensive either in comparison to most red light therapies or something. So we're not talking about red light therapy. We're talking about reducing the overall amount of blue light in your environment, et cetera. Now, for many people who don't want to purchase something new, and again, I have no financial relationship to BON charge. So I don't glean anything. I buy them with my own money. And I just have one or two of them and I dim the lights. Even those red lights I dim while I'm reading at night and then fall asleep. If you don't want to use red lights for whatever reason, then you would be wise to just dim the lights that you have, and where possible to have those lights be set fairly low in your room environment. Now, why would that be? Okay, well, first of all, the cells that activate the alertness system in the brain via the retina, your eye, tend to look up into your environment, and that makes sense because they're essentially there to view sunlight and the presence or absence of sunlight. But in addition to that, think about it logically. If I take a flashlight and I shine a beam on the ground or at a tree in the yard, it looks very bright, but you're not getting all those photons in your eyes, right? You're seeing it at a distance. As opposed to shining the light in your eyes, it's very, very bright, okay? So when you have lights that are overhead and going into your eyes, it's very different than the light being on the floor or on a surface. This gets back to something that I often get asked. How could it be that viewing sunlight through a window takes 50 times longer to activate your circadian system than it does when you step outside? Well, let's think about that. When you step outside, there's sunlight everywhere. If you face the sun, there's even more coming at you. But when you're inside, unless there's a beam of light coming through that window and the window is very clear or open for that matter, you're not really getting the light in your eyes in the same way that if you were outside with the sunlight in your eyes, right? It's the same thing as like looking at a beam of light from a flashlight against a wall versus the beam of light going at your eyes, okay? So we talked about dimming the lights, setting them low in the room. It's not red light therapy, but changing over to red lights. BON charge is probably just one of many out there. I've seen it done pretty nicely with just somebody, people grab red party lights, go on whatever your favorite search engine sales site, red lights, and you can do that. That's gonna be better than any blue lights. And then if you're gonna be on your screens, here's what I suggest. There's a shortcut function in your phone where you can triple click to switch your phone over to eliminate all the blues. This is very different than just using the nighttime function, very different. And I think we should probably put out a video on how to do this. But what you do is you go into the accessibility function on your phone, you go into color filters, and then you drag down the blues, but that's not how your phone is going to be set all day because then you don't see anything that's in blue. But you can introduce a triple click function. I'll put out a clip soon on how to do that. And so when I go to sleep at night or in the evening, what I'll do is I'll triple click and I'll switch my phone over to red only. And that's completely zero cost, by the way. It doesn't cost anything. And then in the morning when I wake up, I click, 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 I turn on, although I try and get the sunlight in my eyes before I look at my phone. What has your process been for the writing of your book? Slow. I have a saying that I say in my lab, or that I have said for many years in doing science, when I was a graduate student, a postdoc, and then in my lab. And by the way, because sometimes people ask about this, I still have research funds for human studies. I closed my animal lab, focusing mainly on teaching, which I'll be doing again this year, teaching in the spring, maybe in the winter as well, to undergraduates. And I may get re-involved in some human clinical studies on vision, an area that I've loved for many years. But in any case, there's a saying that I always would reiterate to my students and postdocs, which is, I go as fast as I carefully can. Okay, so I believe in a sense of urgency. I like to sit down to write and think, okay, I'm gonna go as fast as I carefully can. It's that right balance between urgency and precision. Okay, going fast is rarely good in its own right. Going too slow isn't good either. So there's that place where I feel like I'm just pushing myself a little bit, but then you have to be careful, right? So as fast as you carefully can. So the process has been slow, but I've been going as fast as I carefully can. Any recommendations on overcoming obstacles and how did you deal with them? Yes, put that phone away, put it in the other room. If you have to generate accountability measures, do it. When I used to write grants in my laboratory in San Diego, you can ask my lab, I used to walk in and say, okay, I'm giving my phone to somebody, and if I ask for it back before 5 p.m. today, you each get $1,000. And I did not have $1,000 to give everyone in my lab. I had a pretty big lab and I didn't have the money. So you may have to create some barriers. And gosh, about an hour and a half in, I'd think, okay, gosh, I was supposed to respond to this person today. They're going to think that I've dropped off the map. Oh my goodness. And then I'd remember, well, I have an office phone. If someone really needed to get a hold of me, if it was an emergency, they'd let me know. And if I couldn't be reached that way, someone would find me. I realize for people with kids, etc., this might not be feasible, but if you have to do that, you do that. Set stakes, okay? Give someone a check for an exorbitant amount of money that you can't afford to give away, but that you do have in your bank account. Give them that check and say, you know, if I don't stop writing for the next hour, then you can tear up the check. Otherwise, you can go cash it. So you can put some fear in there, but again, as I mentioned earlier, better to generate these kind of incentives with yourself. So I like to put my phone away. I like to take about 10 minutes to transition into the writing, and then I actually set rules for myself. I don't allow myself to get out of the seat, even to use the bathroom. It's true. I've never gone to the bathroom in my seat, but I resist the temptation to get up until the timer goes off. That's how I did it as an undergraduate. That's how I did it writing grants. That's how I've done it writing fellowships as a graduate student. And that's how I write the book now. And I find that after about 20, 30 minutes, I don't want to stand up. I'm super happy. And then if an interruption comes, then I get frustrated because I want to keep writing. So give it a try. Set some high stakes incentives for yourself. I mean, don't make them too high, but set some high stakes incentive. The basic structure of the Foundational Fitness Protocol is 3 resistance training sessions per week and 3 cardiovascular training sessions per week, and then 1 complete rest day. Now that might sound like a lot to some of you, but in fact, none of the workouts is particularly long. I think the longest workout in that entire Foundational Fitness Protocol is about 60 minutes, maybe 75 minutes if you're moving slowly through the gym because somebody else is in the way, or because you're, checking your phone a little too often, as we all sometimes do, that sort of thing. But the basic structure is as follows. For me, the Foundational Fitness Protocol starts as day 1 on Monday, but you could start it as day 1 on any day of the week, frankly. So day 1 for me is to train legs. So that's quadriceps, hamstrings, and calves, and tibialis work, the front of the shin. For those of you that don't know, I'm a big fan of doing tibialis work. Then the next day is a complete day off, during which you could do, if you wanted, something like deliberate heat or deliberate cold exposure or both, but you don't have to. It's just nice to have a complete day off after training legs, because if you train legs properly, oftentimes it can be a bit tiring, and the next day you're recovering. Then the following day is either a cardiovascular training session of about 20 to 30 minutes of, say, a jog at a slightly more rapid clip than one would consider zone 2 cardio. Zone 2 cardio is where you can carry out a conversation, so a little bit faster than that. Or if you're not feeling like your legs are recovered enough to do that, you could do the resistance training work on that day. The resistance training work that falls in the middle of the week is, believe it or not, torso. I know that for some of you that are into more kind of bodybuilding type routines, training your entire torso on one day might seem like a lot, but really that day just involves some pushing, so some overhead shoulder press type workouts or dips, maybe some bench presses if that's your thing, as well as some pulling, so some rows and some pull-ups or chin-ups, things of that sort. Again, all tailored to you so that you're not doing anything that aggravates any pre-existing injuries, and you're not going to do anything that's going to induce injuries. Okay, so there's some pushing and pulling, maybe a little bit of neck work if you need some additional neck strength, that sort of thing. So with legs on Monday, rest on Tuesday, that falls either on Wednesday or Thursday, depending on how recovered your legs were. Then the next day, which for me typically falls on a Friday, is a high intensity interval training session, although really it's just about VO2 max. It's about getting maximum heart rate where you're breathing really, really hard, and that's a very short workout. The total duration of that workout is anywhere from 8 to 15 minutes total. So for me, it involves getting on an Airdyne bike. Those are those bikes with some resistance because there's a fan, although you could do this on a rower. Basically anything where you can exert yourself to get your heart rate way, way up and breathe very, very hard, where you're not going to injure your musculoskeletal system. You're not going to do any soft tissue damage. So you need to figure out what that is for you. Again, the PDF explains how to select that. For me, it typically means getting on the Airdyne bike and pedaling very hard for about 20 seconds, then resting 10 seconds, 20 seconds hard, 10 seconds rest, 20 seconds hard, for a total of about 8 cycles. by the end of which I'm breathing extremely hard, my heart rate is way, way up, and then I'll just shower and head about my day. And then the following day, which typically for me falls on a Saturday, although again, we're going to talk about flexibility and how to build flexibility into the schedule. The Saturday workout is typically things like biceps, triceps, some calves, maybe a bit more neck work and some abdominal work, So basically small body parts that can recover pretty quickly. And that workout typically takes only about 45 to 50 minutes, maybe 60 minutes maximum. And then the following day, which is of course Sunday, is a day in which I try and get outside and move as much as possible. So I'll typically do the longer Sunday cardio workout as either a ruck, so a backpack with a weight in it. By the way, if you don't own a rucksack, you can just put a gallon water jug in there full and then, drink it as you go. It'll lighten as you go. Or you could get a weight vest if you have the resources to do that. There's some great weight vests out there, of varying weight. You can throw a kid on your shoulders if you got a kid that wants to be carried on your shoulders. You can do it alone, listening to an audiobook, listening to music, or in total silence. I've done all these various versions, by the way. You can do it with family members or with friends. I'll sometimes do this with my significant other. One of the great things about this long Sunday workout is that it's extremely flexible in terms of how social you are, or whether or not you do it in isolation, whether or not you do it on concrete or on dirt. It's very versatile. For instance, if I have friends over and I want to spend time with them, but I also want to get outdoors and do this workout, and if they're interested in getting some outdoor movement as well, we'll all just head out for a hike. And if they are less fit than I am or tend to move more slowly, well, then I'll throw on a 10 or 15, maybe even 30 pound backpack so that I get a good workout out of it. And if they're faster than I am and they're the sort of person who, is a triathlete, I've got some friends who are triathletes and they want to move at a really fast clip, well, then I'm not bringing any weight pack and I'm just going to ask them to, weight up for me because I'm going to have a hard time keeping up, but I'll have to really push myself as I go along. So a lot of versatility. I don't measure my heart rate during any of these workouts, by the way. That's not my preferred way to do things. I know other people like to measure heart rate as they go. I find it's just really nice to get out once a week, if possible, out of doors and just move my body as much as possible so that I head into the week knowing that I got some really terrific outdoor time in nature while benefiting my cardiovascular system and often while socializing with important people in my life as well. One important feature of flexibility that I haven't talked about yet is flexibility within a day. So for me, just personally, again, this is my personal preference. This is by no means dogma. I prefer to get my workouts done first thing in the morning. So I like to get up, hydrate, get some electrolytes in my system, get some caffeine in my system if I'm going to work out. That's right, I said it. I do believe if you experience a crash in energy in the afternoon, delaying your caffeine by about 90 minutes or so after waking can be very beneficial. I know there's some controversy around that, but almost everybody that tries it finds that that's the case. Again, no obligation to do that. It's just a suggestion to, perhaps experiment with if you have an afternoon crash. But for me, and I think for most people, if you're going to work out first thing in the morning and you like caffeine before a workout, drink caffeine first thing in the morning. That's certainly what I do if I'm going to work out that day. I like to have my workouts done before 9 a.m. and ideally before 8:30 a.m. so that I can move into my work day. However, there are days where that simply doesn't happen. And then the question is it okay to move a workout from its typical time, like for me, 7:30 a.m. or so, to the afternoon? And the answer is yes. There's simply no reason why that's not okay. It's not going to cause a significant diminishment in performance. If anything, the data point to the fact that for sake of physical performance and output, workouts in the afternoon are probably more beneficial. I don't know about that result. I mean, that's certainly what the data say. I know for me, I'm most alert and have the most amount of energy first thing in the morning, and so that's when my workouts tend to be best. But if I can't make a workout in the morning, I'll sometimes do it in the afternoon around 2 or 3 p.m., making sure, however, that I don't consume so much caffeine before that workout that it's going to disrupt my sleep. Now, there's another feature of training, which is like sunlight, like meals, like socialization, physical exercise provides an entrainment mechanism, that is a predictive mechanism for your so-called autonomic nervous system that makes it such that at a given hour of the day that you normally train, so for me around 7:30 a.m. or so, you'll notice that there's going to be a peak in physical and mental energy. That's right, if you work out at a given time pretty consistently, your autonomic nervous system will start to anticipate that timing and you'll start to feel an increase in energy around that time. That is not an imagined thing, it's a real thing. It's a short-term entrainment, as we call it. This is something that I'll probably visit in a future full-length episode of the Huberman Lab podcast. But what you'll notice is that around the time that you normally train or run or whatever you want to call it, you start to feel an increase in energy. And you can leverage that by going ahead and training. But if you don't have the opportunity to train, then I do think it's a good idea to still get that training session in at a later time during the day if you have the opportunity. Otherwise, you may have to slide it to the day before or the day after, as we talked about a few minutes ago, or you may have to skip entirely. The point here is that it's always going to be best to complete the workout if you can complete the workout safely and without disrupting your nighttime sleep. I think that's really the biggest takeaway. I personally am not going to compromise sleep and my overall health in order to get workouts in. Every once in a while, I'll force myself to wake up especially early, meaning I'll cash out a couple hours of sleep that I would normally get. So I'll normally get up around, 6 a.m. or 6:30, kind of depends on when I went to sleep. But sometimes I'll give up 2 hours of sleep to get a workout in the morning if I'm going to fly that day. I will sometimes do that. However, if I'm very fatigued, if I've been exposed to colds and flus, I'm feeling kind of run down, then I won't do that. I'll prioritize sleep. Most of the time I prioritize sleep, but there are those occasions in which I'll prioritize the workout. Each and all of us have those options, and my suggestion is to really look at things on a case-by-case, meaning you as an individual, and on a daily basis, taking into account what happened the day before, how stressed you are, how much sleep you're getting, how much exposure to colds and flus, and to pay attention to how hard you've been training recently. You know, if you're on a family vacation and you want more time with family, are you really going to compromise time with family in order to get your workouts in? I think that would be probably a bad idea, if I'm honest. I think you want to prioritize social life. That's super important. But then, of course, you don't want to prioritize social life to the detriment of your physical health. So it's all a bit of give and take. And what I've tried to describe here is, again, a recap of the foundational fitness protocol. The places where there's some flexibility, you can move workouts back a day or forward a day if you like. You could double up if you like, especially if you're getting great rest and you're well fed, etc. And you can also move the workout up or down in the day, depending on how much energy you have, how much sleep you've gotten, and of course how rigid you are with yourself. Some people are just really rigid. They are completely in the non-negotiable stance. They get their workout in no matter what because they feel as if they don't, then they're going to be grumpy or they're going to fall off schedule. Other people like me try to get the workouts done, I would say anywhere from 85 to 95% of the time I get those workouts done. Occasionally I skip them, typically because life stress, travel, or some sort of low-grade illness, a cold or a flu or something of that sort. I get those pretty rarely, but they do happen. So that's really how I answer this question of how to build flexibility into one's fitness schedule. I should also mention that I'm a big believer in periodization. So I will do 4-month blocks of training heavier with the weights. So that's in the 3 to 5 repetition range. Then another 3 to 4 month block will follow where I'm training slightly less heavy. So I'll typically be using anywhere from 5 to 8 repetition range. And then for the next 4-month block, I'll be using somewhere between 8 and 15 repetition range. Every once in a while, I'll mix it up so that, if I've been training heavy a lot, I might do a lighter workout, or if I've been training lighter, I might do a heavy workout. Again, not super rigid. I personally find that by being strict and rigid about the scheduling, about the reps and the sets, etc., for most of the time, meaning about 85 to 95% of workouts and across the year, that things just work out great. You'll make constant progress without having to drive yourself and everybody else crazy with extreme rigidity and compulsivity around training. And then, of course, you can enjoy those days off. You can enjoy the flexibility in your schedule because, yes, physical fitness is wonderful, but unless you're an athlete, especially a professional athlete, really, physical fitness is about being able to lean into other aspects of life with more vigor. At least that's what it's about for me, and I think that's what it's about for most people. The top 3 most impactful things schools could do to raise student capacity for learning. What a great question. Well, I'll add a 4th because I don't want to try and wriggle out of the question by just saying sleep again. But I think trying to get kids to sleep enough is going to be key. So that means off phones and iPads in the middle of the night. That means starting school a little bit later. I don't know if that's ever going to work, but that would be a marvelous thing for learning because, as you know, or we all should know or remember, neuroplasticity and learning is triggered by focused attention, which is supported by having slept well the night before, but the actual rewiring of neural connections occurs when? It occurs during sleep. It occurs during deep sleep and rapid eye movement sleep. That's when the reorganization of neural connections occurs, the strengthening of particular synapses, the weakening of other synapses, and there's a small, perhaps infinitesimally small percentage of neuroplasticity that is the consequence of the addition of new neurons. So most neuroplasticity is not that. Most neuroplasticity is the reorganization of existing neural connections. But nonetheless, that happens during sleep. So getting kids to sleep enough, nap enough, sleep late if they need to, is actually a great thing. But who knows if schools will change their protocols. What else can we do? What can schools do? Well, I'm a big fan, as you know, of non-sleep deep rest. Wouldn't it be wonderful if in every school it started the day with a 5-minute meditation or non-sleep deep rest, where kids would do some quiet, focused breathing, bringing their attention back to their breathing, bringing their attention back to the spot just behind their forehead, just before beginning a learning session. Why? Why? Is it about mysticism? No. Is it about trying to understand consciousness? No. It's about a study done by Wendy Suzuki's laboratory at New York University. She's their current dean of letters and science, as far as I know. She's a neuroscientist. She has a spectacular record in the field of neuroscience and psychology. And her laboratory showed that even a very brief meditation session, in that particular study it was about 13 minutes per day, can significantly improve working memory, which is the ability to keep information online in one's mind, active. It can increase other forms of memory. It can increase focus. It can decrease stress. And it is a zero-cost tool. So I think, unfortunately, we think of meditation as a mystical tool to explore consciousness, and it can be, but if you think about it, exercise can also be an ultra marathon to run 242 miles or something to win a trophy, or it can be something to improve cardiovascular health. So similarly, meditation is just a perceptual exercise. I think that if kids learn that they can bring their perception internally to what we call interoception, as opposed to looking at things externally, exteroception, understand that they have some control, some regulation over their focus and attention, bringing their attention back to them, to interoception whenever it drifts, well, then they get better at focus over time, and it improves learning in the long term, but also in the bout of learning that they go into immediately after. So, if I had a magic wand, every classroom would begin a session of learning with 5 minutes or maybe even 3 minutes of what is typically known as third eye or focused meditation, with no interest in mysticism, pure interest in improving the bout of learning. I think another thing that schools should include to increase capacity for learning is they should include microgaps. So we know that if you take gaps in information delivery, so for instance, if I were to just pause now and then continue, so it seems like kind of an odd interruption, and then every once in a while at random introduce a short 10-second pause or so, what do we know happens? We know, based on now a number of different really high quality papers that have looked at musical learning, mathematical learning, concept learning, physical skill learning, that those little micro gaps allow for very rapid replay of the information that's relevant, for whatever reason, in reverse, in the brain very quickly within the hippocampus and the neocortex areas of the brain, critical for encoding and storage of memories. And these little micro gaps and the rapid replay of the information one is trying to learn at 20 to 30 times the normal rate increases the number of repetitions. You're basically getting 30 repetitions for doing nothing. This is exactly what happens in rapid eye movement sleep. When you learn something, like maybe you learned something today in our discussion thus far, and you go to sleep at night, there's a very strong chance that if we were to record from your brain, we would see that the same areas of your brain that were active during specific portions of this discussion, which arguably is more of a lecture than a discussion, but those brain areas would repeat at 20 to 30 times speed within a very compressed time, and then you'd go back to a different pattern of brain activity. What is going on? Well, in rapid eye movement sleep, the brain is rehearsing. It's generating repetitions of certain forms of behavior and certain forms of learning of cognitive information. At high speed, you're generating more repetitions, and this is critical for the learning process. We know this from animal studies. We now know this from human studies as well. So if in the classroom, teachers would just say, okay, we just finished discussing, the cell cycle or the Krebs cycle. Now let's take a moment. and students are not checking their phone at that time or reviewing the material at that time. They just got 20 to 30 repetitions of, and by the way, at a subconscious level, they're not aware of it, of the material they had just been exposed to. And so you introduce these, at random. You could do anywhere from 1 to 5 of these per hour. You could do as many as 10 per hour. You're just introducing these brief micro rest intervals. There's a beautiful literature to support this. And the third thing, it's very important, is I think it's very, very clear that physical activity, in particular cardiovascular training, any kind of physical activity, running, jogging, swimming, etc., is going to facilitate learning, especially if the learning is done immediately after that activity. That's right, if the learning is done immediately after that activity, and that's probably related to the increase in the various catecholamines, dopamine, epinephrine, and norepinephrine associated with physical activity, that make encoding of new memories, encoding of new information more readily accessible. So this is a call for including PE class or even just some basic movement, even walks or things of that sort. We can look at this through the other lens and say, what are the worst things for learning? Terrible sleep, being delivered information like through a fire hose with no pauses, and forgive me if from time to time I tend to do that. Maybe I should start introducing microgaps into the podcast, but you can always just pause it, go back to it. I feel like real life provides that. There is the strong incentive for including some physical movement each day. And then I suppose if we were going to include another one, we'd say that kids and teachers should have a discussion about optimal learning protocols. They should understand where their thresholds are after which their attention falls off. There's really no point in trying to learn information if you're not focused on what you're trying to learn. And then there's a whole discussion to be had about caffeine. There's a whole discussion to be had about nutrition as it relates to maintaining alertness throughout the day. Anyone that's ever gone into a lecture on a college campus or a high school or elementary school, even after lunch, you'll see that people's brains are just kind of idling there in the background. It's the rare student that's wrapped with attention even after a big lunch, even after running around outside. So structuring of the day properly is essential, and of course get that sleep at night.
What does your morning routine look like at the moment?
Morning routine is wake up.
Round about what time?
I'm waking up these days around 6 a.m., 6:30 a.m. I'm trying to go to sleep by about 10:30 p.m. Sometimes it's 11, sometimes it's 10. I wake up, and I have to be careful here because whenever I've described my routine in a little bit of detail, people always say, "I can't believe you don't go to the bathroom." And it's like, well, of course, so I want to be
my pants on,
exactly, right
on.
foot, left foot. So I want to be clear. I take care of my basic functions. But when I wake up, I make a beeline for sunlight. So I'm going to get sunlight in my eyes. I'll probably go into the grave saying this, so forgive me if people have heard me say this before, but the single best thing you can do for your sleep, your energy, your mood, your wakefulness, your metabolism is to get natural light in your eyes early in the day. Don't wear sunglasses to do it. It takes about 10 minutes or so. If you live in a cloudy area, if you're in the UK in the winter, yes.
Or the summer,
maybe you resort to some artificial light as a replacement, but as much as one can, get bright, natural, and if not natural, artificial light in your eyes early in the day without sunglasses. Contacts and eyeglasses are fine. Don't try and do it through a window or windshield. It's going to take far too long. This sets in motion a huge number of different neurobiological and hormonal cascades that are good for you, reduces stress late at night, offsets cortisol, a million different things really that are good for you. So I get that. And yes, sometimes...
Is that a walk? Doing a little walk?
Ideally, that would be a walk, but sometimes we'll just go into the yard and have some coffee and soak in whatever sunlight through the clouds. If it's a cloudy, overcast day, it might be 20, 30 minutes. If it's a very bright day, it might just be a few minutes. But really the quality studies on humans that have looked at this say, try and get as much natural light as you can in the morning hours, whenever it is that is for you, especially the first 3 hours after waking. If you can work outside, great. If you can get near a window, because as opposed to just in a dark conference room, that's better. But if you can get outside, that would be fantastic. So I get sunlight. I hydrate, I drink water, and then yerba mate is my favorite form of caffeine.
Are you waiting? How long are you waiting from
90
waking?
to 120 minutes.
What have you been doing in that? You've had your light in the eyes. What have you been doing between that and the yerba mate 90 minutes?
I do everything I can to not do email, not do social media, and to take care of a few critical tasks. These days, I have this obsession with trying to do one cognitively hard thing a day, and one physically hard thing a day. Now, not extreme physical, not David Goggins level workouts or anything, but in that 90 minutes, I'll typically try and read a research article start to finish, or I'll work on a document that I might be doing a grant or a research paper, or planning a podcast or researching a podcast. I try and get my brain into kind of a linear mode. I try and narrow that aperture. Because if I don't, the distraction that's created by social media and interactions with others can kind of wick out into the rest of the day. So I'm not necessarily trying to finish something in that time, but I try and do something challenging. I experience great pleasure from battling through something mentally challenging, but that's something that I built up since my university years, when I was about 19 or so, got serious about school and really started to experience the deep pleasure of like, I figured that out, or like, that was really tough. I don't always succeed, but that's what I'm doing in that hour to 90 minutes. But I confess sometimes we'll take a walk during that time and maybe talk through some things that are challenging, or sometimes I get lazy and I'll miss a day of that cognitive challenge. Then I do caffeine about 90 to 120 minutes after waking. And even though I prefer to work out earlier, I generally will then do some sort of physical workout. I have a very consistent routine. I've done it for 30 years, where I weight train for 45 or minutes to an hour every other day. And occasionally I take an extra day off. And occasionally, due to travel or other commitments, I'll occasionally double up 2 days and then take 2 days off.
Yep.
So it's really boring, to talk about workout schedules, but it's really simple. It's like, I'll do a kind of pushing day, rest, pulling day, upper body push, up, rest, upper body pull, rest, and then legs, take 2 days off, something like that.
Are you doing, on the off days, are you doing some sort of zone 3?
Always jogging or skipping rope. Those are my favorite forms of cardio. Sometimes swimming, but typically I'll go running for 30 to 45 minutes. Or if I'm feeling a little bit lazier, because I always find the high intensity stuff to be easier than the long drawn out stuff, I'll sometimes throw on a weight vest, a 30 or 50 pound weight vest, and I'll go out for a shorter run. Or I'm a big fan of Knees Over Toes, Ben Patrick. I know you had him on.
Yeah, great guy.
We were down in Costa Rica with him and his wife, who had the best time and learned so much. I'll occasionally do a backwards, hill walk, or throw on the weight vest for that. We sometimes will get bands and we'll so there's a great way to combine this. We will sometimes get two people in one of these thick bands, do hill walks in the morning while getting our sunlight.
Yeah.
But that I don't really consider a workout. I consider that just kind of rehabilitate as a movement. So on the off days, I'm doing cardio, and sometimes that's in the morning, sometimes that's in the evening. I do not like to weight train in the second half of the day because I like to be really caffeinated when I weight train. I like to listen to loud, fast music. Most of the time, not always. I keep my phone out or off for most workouts. Podcasts maybe if I'm running, but I really try hard when I'm working out to just focus on the workout. And those workouts, the weight training workouts, are always 10 minutes or so of warm up, and then no more than 40 to 50 minutes of really hard work. If I do train hard any longer, I don't recover enough to be able to come in a few days later. And when I train that way, I generally make pretty consistent progress.
And you're taking yourself up until, what's that, probably maybe 10, 30, 11 a.m., something like that now?
Yeah, and then I'll eat my first real meal. Now, occasionally I'll wake up really hungry if I didn't eat that well the night before. But typically after I train, I'll eat. I like oatmeal after I train. Oatmeal, fruit, some fish oil, protein drink, and then maybe 90 to 120 minutes after that, I'll have a real lunch. My lunch is pretty much the biggest meal of the day. If I have my way, it'll be a steak, a salad, maybe a little more starch, although I sort of got it earlier. Brazil nuts. That meal sometimes can extend longer and longer.
I love to eat. A feeding fast,
I love to eat. Yeah, so I'll eat, and then I confess I usually will work a little bit more for about 30 minutes or an hour, typically email, and then I'll take a 10 to 30 minute yoga nidra nap or a nap, and then come back refreshed.
I really struggle with the naps, man. I come back after that and my emotions are all over the place. I'm disoriented. Maybe it's because I struggle to fall asleep super quickly, and therefore I'm extending that period out for a little bit longer than I need. I probably need to try the yoga nidra thing, but for me, I'm absolutely all over if I do that. I wake up and I don't know what day it is, and my emotions always feel a little bit out of whack as well.
I wake up grumpy from naps sometimes, I'm told.
Okay.
There are a few times when I've woken up just really angry. I have no idea what that's about. I don't know any of the neurochemistry associated with that. Sometimes I wake up from naps, it's really pleasant. I'll occasionally do, if the nap is early enough in the day, afterwards I'll have a nice double espresso and get back into work. That's the hardest part of the day, actually. If I was well structured in the early part of the day, it's that 2 or 3 p.m. The key is then to try and get something really useful done cognitively again. So some people might look at this and say, wait, you're working for an hour in the morning and 30 minutes here and an hour in the afternoon. When are you actually working? But it's really about the depth of the trench when you're working. I wake up in the morning and I want to reach for my phone. But I know that even if I were to crank up the brightness on that phone screen, it's not bright enough to trigger that cortisol spike and for me to be at my most alert and focused throughout the day and to optimize my sleep at night. So what I do is I get out of bed and I go outside, and if it's a bright, clear day and the sun is low in the sky or the sun is starting to get overhead, what we call low solar angle, then I know I'm getting outside at the right time. If there's cloud cover and I can't see the sun, I also know I'm doing a good thing, because it turns out, especially on cloudy days, you want to get outside and get as much light energy or photons in your eyes. But let's say it's a very clear day and I can see where the sun is. I do not need to stare directly into the sun. If it's very low in the sky, I might do that because it's not going to be very painful to my eyes. However, if the sun is a little bit brighter and a little bit higher in the sky, sometimes it can be painful to look at. So the way to get this sunlight viewing early in the day is to look toward the sun. If it's too bright to look at directly, well then don't do that. You just look toward it but not directly at it. It's absolutely fine to blink. In fact, I encourage you to blink whenever you feel the impulse to blink. Never look at any light, sunlight or otherwise, that's so bright that it's painful to look at because you can damage your eyes. But for this morning sunlight viewing, it's best to not wear sunglasses. That's right, to not wear sunglasses, at least for this morning sunlight viewing. It is absolutely fine to wear eyeglasses or contact lenses, so-called corrective lenses. In fact, those will serve you well in this practice or this tool because they will focus the light onto your neural retina and onto those melanopsin intrinsically photosensitive ganglion cells. If your eyeglasses or contact lenses have UV protection, that's okay. There's so many different wavelengths of light coming from the sun, and they are bright enough that they will trigger the mechanisms that you want triggered at this early time of day. So try and get outside, ideally within the first 5 minutes of waking, or maybe it's 15 minutes, but certainly within the first hour after waking. I want to share with you 3 critical things about this tool of morning sunlight viewing. First of all, this is not some woo biology thing. This is grounded in the core of our physiology. There are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of quality peer-reviewed papers showing that light viewing early in the day is the most powerful stimulus for wakefulness throughout the day, and it has a powerful positive impact on your ability to fall and stay asleep at night. So this is really the foundational power tool for ensuring a great night's sleep and for feeling more awake during the day. Second of all, if you wake up before the sun is out, you can and probably should flip on artificial lights in your internal home environment or apartment or wherever you happen to live if your goal is to be awake. Right? If you wake up at 4 a.m. and you need to be awake, well then turn on artificial lights. Once the sun is out, however, once the sun has risen, then you still want to get outside and view sunlight. Some of you will wake up before the sun comes out, and if you're asking whether or not turning on artificial lights can replace sunlight at those hours, unfortunately, the answer is no. Unless you have a very special light, we'll talk about what kind of light, the bright artificial lights in your home environment are not, I repeat, are not going to be sufficiently bright to turn on the cortisol mechanism and the other wake-up mechanisms that you need early in the day. Diabolical twist, however, is that those lights in your home or apartment or even on your phone are bright enough to disrupt your sleep if you look at them too late at night or in the middle of the night. So there's this asymmetry in our retinal, our eye biology, and in our brain's biology, whereby early in the day, right around waking, you need a lot of light, a lot of photons, a lot of light energy. And artificial lights generally just won't accomplish what you need them to accomplish. But at night, even a little bit of artificial light can really mess up your so-called circadian, your 24-hour clocks, and all these mechanisms that we're talking about. So if you wake up before the sun is out and it's still dark, please turn on as many bright artificial lights as you possibly can or need, but then get outside once the sun is out. On cloudy days, you especially need to get outside. I repeat, on cloudy days, overcast days, you especially need to get outside and get sunlight. You just need to get more of it. Now, how much light and how much light viewing do you need? This is going to vary depending on person and place, I mean, literally where you live on Earth, whether or not there's a lot of tree cover, whether or not you're somebody who has sensitive eyes or less sensitive eyes. It's really impossible for me to give an absolute prescriptive, but we can give some general guidelines. In general, on a clear day, meaning no cloud cover or minimal cloud cover, you want to get this sunlight exposure to your eyes for about 5 minutes or so. Could be 3 minutes one day, could be 7 minutes the next day, about 5 minutes. On a day where there's cloud cover, so the sun is just peeking through the clouds or it's more dense cloud cover, you want to get about 10 minutes of sunlight exposure to your eyes early in the day. And on days that are really densely overcast or maybe even are rainy, you're going to want to get as much as 20 or 30 minutes of sunlight exposure. Another key thing is do not forget about, just don't try and get this sunlight exposure through a car or a window, whether or not it's tinted or otherwise. It takes far too long. It's simply not going to trigger the relevant mechanisms. You would be standing there all day trying to get enough light into your eyes from the morning sunlight, and by then, the sun will have already moved from low solar angle to overhead, and it simply won't work for all sorts of mechanisms related to your circadian rhythm functions. So just don't try and do it through a windshield, sunglasses, or a window. It's just not going to work. Get outside. If the weather is really bad or for whatever reason, safety reasons, you cannot get outside, well then I suppose try and get near a window. That would be the last resort. But you really want to get outside to get this sunlight exposure. A question I often get is, how long should I try to focus? Well, the research literature point to the key importance of so-called ultradian cycles. You've all probably heard of circadian cycles or circadian biology. Circa, the day, circadian, is about 24-hour cycle. Well, our brain and body operate within that day, or within each and every day, I should say, with 90-minute ultradian cycles. So my suggestion would be, anytime you're going to sit down and try and focus, you're going to try and do a focused bout of physical exercise or skill learning or musical learning, or maybe you're even just having a conversation. Maybe you're a therapist or you're attending therapy or a class. How long should it be? And the ideal duration is about 90 minutes. Not exactly 90 minutes, but we can reliably say 90 minutes or less. Okay, it doesn't have to be the full 90 minutes, but trying to push yourself to be able to drop into 2 hours of focus or 3 hours of focus, while possible, is not really in line with what we know about the underlying biology. Everything from our sleep states, or the different stages of sleep, and our waking states is divided into these 90-minute cycles, or so-called ultradian cycles. So what I like to do is set a timer for 90 minutes. I acknowledge and accept the fact that under most conditions, unless I'm really pressed for a deadline and I'm optimally caffeinated, etc., the first 5 to 10 minutes of that 90 minutes are a transition time. It's like the warm-up for focus, but I do include it in that 90 minutes. And then I really try and drop into doing focused mental work or learning of some sort. Again, this could be physical as well, motor skill learning, or anything we're running or lifting weights, etc., and really try and drop into that across the full 90 minutes, again, accepting the fact, okay? It's not just an idea, the fact that occasionally our focus will flicker. It will jump out of focus, and then a big part of being able to focus is to go back to focusing. The way I'd like you to conceptualize this, perhaps, is that arrowhead suddenly getting very, very broad, that you're focusing on many things, or that arrow shifts to a different location in the room. The key is to be able to shift it back and to narrow it once again, and that's an active process. So much so that it requires a lot of metabolic energy. Your brain is the chief consumer of metabolic energy. The calories that you consume is so-called basal metabolic rate. Most of that isn't related to movement or heartbeat or breathing. It's related to brain function. Your brain is a glutton with respect to caloric need. So understand that at the end of 90 minutes, or maybe even after 45 minutes, you might feel rather tired or even exhausted. And it's very important that after a bout of focus, that you take at least 10 minutes and ideally as long as 30 minutes, and go through what I call deliberate defocus. You really want to focus on somewhat menial tasks or things that really don't require a ton of your concentration. This is starting to become a little bit of a movement out there in the kind of pop psychology and optimization world, this idea of not looking at your phone as you walk down the hall to the bathroom, certainly not looking at your phone in the bathroom. And I should mention, by the way, this is a particular annoyance of mine. Have you noticed that wait times for restrooms in public places has increased substantially in the last 10 years? The reason for that is not digestive, okay? It's not the gut microbiome. I mean, it might be the gut microbiome, but chances are it's because people are on their phones in the bathroom. So you're doing yourself and everybody else a favor by staying off your phone in the restroom, staying off your phone while walking down the hall. Try and give yourself some time to deliberately decompress, to let your mental states idle, to not be focused on any one thing. That period of idling is essential for your ability to focus, much in the same way that rest between sets of resistance training or rest between exercise is vital to being able to focus and perform during the actual sets or during the actual bouts of running or cycling or whatever your particular form of exercise might be. So deliberate decompression is key. And I know this is hard because we're all being drawn in by the incredible, rich array of sensory information available on our phones and other devices. But I can't emphasize this enough. Our ability to focus is not just related to what happens during the entry and movement through those focus bouts, but after those focus bouts, we really need to deliberately decompress. And of course, the ultimate decompress, the time in which we are not directing our thinking and our action, is during sleep. And so it's no wonder, or I should say it holds together logically, that deep, long-lasting duration of not controlling where our mind is at is in fact the ultimate form of restoration, even if we have very intense dreams. How are you managing to achieve your key health pillars while in Australia and any other place you've enjoyed doing so, all while working so hard? Well, thanks for the question. I'll answer this question in the context of what I think we all can and should and really will do, because if you're a premium channel subscriber, certainly you're taking your health seriously. So first off, I think there's a bit of a misconception about the protocols on the Huberman Lab podcast, being that we are all, including myself, super regimented about them to the point where we don't enjoy other things in life, and that's simply not true. So I view the protocols of the Huberman Lab podcast as science-based, actionable, low cost, zero cost, minimal cost in almost all situations. There are a few exceptions to that, but it's really designed to mesh with the rest of life and enhance mental health and physical health, which of course means remaining social, staying on typical sleep schedules, etc. So the big ones for me when arriving here were, of course, to get morning sunlight as often as possible. Saw a beautiful sunrise this morning over Sydney, but even on the overcast days, we've had a few rainy overcast days, to really make it a point to get outside and to get that morning sunlight. Also, our crew did travel in with a red light, not a red light panel, although I do have a couple red light panels, those little portable ones that I use from time to time. The red lights I'm referring to in reference to answering this question are the red lights, which are just red light bulb that I actually travel with a little red light bulb unit. It's just like a small, screw-in unit. You plug it in here with an adapter, of course, and then in the evening we've switched off the lights in the place where we're staying, and it just brings the overall levels of cortisol down low very quickly, and it makes it very easy to get to sleep each night. It makes a big difference, and this is a very low-cost tool. You could essentially purchase any red light, even red party lights, and put those up and then switch off the regular overhead lights. It makes a big difference. It's probably even cost-saving. We've also stayed fairly regimented about exercise. So this morning, took a great jog down to the ocean, jumped in the ocean. If you don't have access to an ocean on vacation, just getting outside and getting some movement early in the day can help shift your rhythm. Really the quadfecta of shifting your circadian rhythm in a new place or becoming an early riser, if you want to do that, is morning sunlight, movement, social engagement, and in my case, caffeine. Although some people would opt for eating breakfast, I just happen to prefer to eat a little bit later in the day. So when you combine those things, you are really amplifying that morning cortisol increase that I've talked about on the podcast, morning catecholamine release, so dopamine, epinephrine, and norepinephrine, and those act in synergy to create more early day and daytime mood focus and alertness and enhance the transition to nighttime sleep. But of course, that dimming of the lights and maybe even red light in the evening really can help. And so those are the biggies. And then of course, if you want to shift your circadian rhythm really quickly to be on a local schedule, it helps to hop on the local meal schedule. But for me, that always means skipping breakfast. I'm not a big breakfast eater. I like lunch, an afternoon snack sometimes, and dinner. So when you do all of those things, it makes it very easy to stay with the health pillars. And of course, stress control is important. We're doing lives. There's a lot of work to do. So there's a daily, for me, non-sleep deep rest or yoga nidra protocol. I have followed your sleep advice and I have seen a huge improvement. Great, happy to hear that. Wonderful. But I still wake up at night and only get 5 or 6 hours. Is that enough? Can you please give more advice if possible? Well, first of all, thanks for tuning into the sleep advice. So the question of whether or not 5 or 6 hours is enough really depends on person, context, and by context, I mean it can even change across the course of the year by life circumstances. The criteria for insomnia are very clear. Insomnia is excessive daytime sleepiness due to lack of sleep at night. Excessive daytime sleepiness due to lack of sleep at night. So if you're not falling asleep during the day and you feel reasonably good throughout the day, maybe you only need a brief 10-minute to 30-minute nap in the afternoon. Some people nap, some people don't like to nap. Doesn't matter. But if you feel pretty good throughout the day and you have enough mental and physical energy and focus to complete the activities that you need to complete, then I wouldn't worry so much about 5 to 6 hours. And I wouldn't obsess over, these kind of scary things that we hear. Oh, if we're not getting 7 to 8 hours, that we get dementia, etc. Because that's not necessarily the case. Everyone has different sleep needs. The other thing, and this is perhaps the most important thing for everybody listening to this really to think about, is QQRT, which is quality, quantity, timing. Quality, quantity, regularity, and timing, QQRT, which is an acronym coined by the great Matt Walker, author of the book Why We Sleep. He has his own terrific podcast in his own right. There's a series on the Huberman Lab podcast coming out soon. QQRT is what you really need to think about when you think about your sleep. So you want to think about the quantity. How much are you getting? Well, you, Rima, who asked this question, are getting 5 to 6 hours a night. Okay, what about the quality of that sleep? Is it consistently 5 to 6 hours with no breaks, or is there a break in the middle? One trip to the restroom in the middle of the night is considered normal and healthy for most people. If you're making multiple trips to the restroom in the middle of the night, or you're waking up multiple times throughout the night on a regular basis, that's something to try and overcome. So the quality piece is important. Also, whether or not you remember your dreams or you don't, you want to make sure that you're getting ample amounts of slow wave sleep, which dominates the first half of your sleep night, and rapid eye movement sleep, which dominates the second half of your sleep night, because they have different roles in recovery of brain and body. Namely, slow wave, aka deep sleep, is responsible for growth hormone release. Rapid eye movement sleep responsible for the unpacking or the uncoupling of emotions to prior day and previous day experiences, and in that way acts as a kind of a scrubbing out or a therapy for your emotional state. So are you feeling emotionally rested when you wake up? Is a good indication of whether or not you're getting enough rapid eye movement sleep. Some people like sleep trackers, using their 8 Sleep or their Whoop or their Oura Ring or something like that. I'm a fan of sleep trackers, but I think that relying too heavily on sleep scores can be risky. There are data from Ali Crumb's lab at Stanford showing that if people receive a poor sleep score, even though they sleep well, their performance will drop. If people get a good sleep score, even though their sleep was lousy, their performance is maintained or even enhanced. So you don't want to take any one sleep score and overinterpret it. You want to look at the average and compare that to your subjective experience of sleep. Maybe I would say go about halfway through your day, if you can bear to do it, before looking at your sleep score and see how you feel. Then look at your sleep score as opposed to the other way around. That might be a good way to adjust for that belief effect I just mentioned. But if you're getting enough quantity, let's say you get 5 to 6 hours, then quality, you're sleeping through that bout, maybe with one epoch of waking up. And then the regularity of your sleep is that you're going to sleep more or less at the same time each night, plus or minus an hour, on, let's say, 5 to 6 days per week, because sometimes we like to stay up on a weekend night and have some fun or something like that. And then the timing, where that sleep is falling in your 24-hour schedule is really key. And here's what we're learning as a field, that for many people who are early to bed, early to rise types, if they go to bed around 9 p.m., 9:30, and they only get 6 hours of sleep, they feel great. Whereas if they get the equivalent amount of sleep but go to bed at 11 p.m. or midnight, they feel lousy. Similarly, if you're a night owl, you're somebody that really prefers to go to bed around 1 or 2 a.m. and wake up around, let's say, 10 a.m., if you take that equivalent amount of sleep and you go to bed earlier, you're going to feel not so good. So getting the timing of your sleep in the 24-hour cycle correct and fairly consistent, that's the R part of QQRT, correct, is going to be beneficial. So I wouldn't worry so much about 5 to 6 hours only. Here's what I would do, Rima. I would take that 5 to 6 hours, and before getting out of bed each morning, I would do a 10 to 30 minute NSDR, non-sleep deep rest protocol, which will allow you to feel deeply rested and frankly, to recover whatever bits of sleep that you perhaps missed during the night. I found that to be a tremendously beneficial practice. Waking up, if I don't feel thoroughly rested, doing a 10 to 30 minute NSDR, then getting out of bed and continuing the day. And if you don't have time to do that 10 minute, maybe 20 minute NSDR later in the day at any point. And I think you'll see terrific results, not just because you're recovering some sleep that you lost perhaps during the night, or maybe you just need 5 to 6 hours, but also because you'll get better at falling and staying deeply asleep through the practice of NSDR in the morning or at some point throughout the day. I wouldn't recommend anything else elaborate unless you're feeling really exhausted during the day, in which case then I would move to some of the more advanced sleep tools. What can be done to improve brain function for people that have been negatively impacted by things such as poor sleep, poor diet, and TBI early in life? James. Yeah, this is a great question, and I get this a lot. I think that it reminds me that a lot of the conversation that we have on the podcast is about the good things that happen when you do things right and the bad things that happen when you do things wrong. And while I think that's an important conversation, what I've frankly failed to do enough, and that's why I'm grateful for this question, because it gives me the opportunity to talk more about the fact that your system is very robust. There is neuroplasticity. And also, as my graduate advisor used to say, time machine's broken, which is not to say, you're out of luck, but I wouldn't spend any extra energy thinking about how many how many, I have to be careful. The seed oil debate is still a debate. It's unclear. How many trans fats you were exposed to in childhood. We know trans fats are bad. Everyone agrees they're bad. Governments agree they're bad. This is perhaps one of the few things that everybody agrees on in the nutrition space. Trans fats are bad. When I was growing up, trans fats were abundant in foods. There were probably fewer of certain things that we have more of now that are bad, but we ate a lot of trans fats. We had margarine in our fridge. There were other things that probably weren't good for us that we consumed. And every once in a while I'll think, gosh, if I had only been eating, grass-fed meats and fruits and vegetables and healthy grains as I do now back then, imagine how much healthier I'd be. But I really don't spend too much time on it, and I don't think you should either. I think the most important thing to remember is that biological systems, unless they're really damaged, you're talking about a major injury, and even then, they're very robust. You can overcome years, decades of poor use or misuse of those systems. That said, if you have the opportunity to take care of them now, I highly suggest you do. So, for instance, if you haven't slept well for years, now's the time to get it right. I wouldn't worry about the past, truly. You can always rescue some of your health span and lifespan. Poor diet, same thing. It's a just do it kind of thing. Just hop on the train of getting things right 80 to 90% of the time. TBI, traumatic brain injury. Well, the episode of the Huberman Lab podcast that's out right now with Dr. Mark D'Esposito, he's an MD, a neurologist, originally trained at University of Pennsylvania, now at University of California, Berkeley. We talk about TBI. There are a lot of different forms of TBI, different origins, everything from bomb blast to car accident to construction work to just, slipped on the stairs at a party. I know someone that slipped on some wet floor at a party and, has a brain injury. What do we know? Well, you get back to the basics. Sleep is going to be important, but there are some things like transcranial magnetic stimulation, certainly things that reduce brain inflammation like glymphatic outflow. So glymphatic outflow is this washing of the brain at night that removes debris. Very, very important. in the weeks and months after traumatic brain injury to get adequate sleep for that reason. But then there are things that also seem to perhaps improve outcomes from traumatic brain injury, such as hyperbaric chamber, so hyperoxygenation treatments, if you have access to those. Even things like elevating the feet slightly when you sleep by about 5 to 15 degrees is known to increase lymphatic flow during sleep, which can, we believe, by way of increased clearance of a bunch of basically debris, reactive oxygen species within the cells, but also debris outside the cells in the extracellular space. So between neurons, there isn't just empty space. There's all this like heavily glycosylated stuff, which basically just means this kind of like spongy carbohydrate stuff that fills in the spaces. The clearance of some of the metabolites and some of the debris that's accumulated there by just sleeping with feet slightly elevated. Definitely not falling asleep in a chair upright. That's the worst thing for lymphatic flow. Things like that. Some people go kind of bonkers on all things anti-inflammation. They start taking tons of curcumin and they kind of get obsessed with inflammation as the enemy. I wouldn't do that. In fact, there's some negative effects of things like curcumin. Turmeric, if you take it in high doses, like limiting the amount of dihydrotestosterone production, which is not good. You don't want that. Male or female, you don't want to take too much turmeric or curcumin. There are real issues with that, to say nothing of the studies that have shown lead contamination in a lot of turmeric, so you want to check the sourcing very carefully if you do consume any turmeric. A little bit is probably fine. Cooking with it is fine, but we're talking about supplementation and just really not trying to turn inflammation into this terrible thing to the point where you're starting to do other things that are potentially damaging. There's some really interesting evidence that 5 grams, maybe 10 grams, depending on your body weight, of creatine monohydrate per day can enhance creatine phosphate metabolism in the forebrain and enhance brain function under conditions of high altitude or TBI. I take 5 to 10 grams of creatine, just creatine monohydrate powder. And frankly, any creatine monohydrate powder should be sufficient. There are other forms of creatine. They are not any better. Creatine monohydrate is the least expensive, fortunately. That mixed in water, you take it with or without food. Some people ask, does creatine make your hair fall out? No, it does not make your hair fall out, but some people do experience an increase in DHT with creatine monohydrate, and there can be a DHT hair loss link. So if you think you're losing your hair from taking creatine, then stop and do the control experiment. It should grow back. But 5 to 10 grams of creatine monohydrate, something to explore hyperbaric chamber, something to explore excellent sleep. Definitely do that. And I just wouldn't obsess over past ills or wrongs to the extent that it impacts your ability to try and correct those in the present. I would say that about most everything. But then again, I understand that as humans, because we can remember the past, the present, and the future, that sometimes, it's difficult to let go of the mistakes of past that we made, but that's just simply being human, and I don't have a solution to that. If you find that you work out in the morning and then you're really, really sleepy in the afternoon and the next day, you might be working out too long or too hard. So maybe ratchet back the intensity a little bit or the duration. It's amazing how great we can feel when we work out to like 80 to 90% of our maximum output and duration. We did this the other day. We went out for a little jog, run, bounding, skipping, jumping jack thing, and stopped at like 80 to 90% of maximum, and then went about the rest of the day and evening feeling great. If you do this, consistently, you'll find you have more energy, and there's actually a lot of solid physiology and physics to support why that is, as opposed to if you go to the gym and you do every set to failure, or even every exercise you include one set to failure, and you're grinding out 4 reps, or I don't know what kind of exercise you're doing, or you're running more and more distance each day or with more intensity. It's understandable how one gets kind of drawn to or addicted to that burn or the effort, but keep in mind that is stress. You're stressing the body to produce a certain kind of adaptation, either endurance or strength or hypertrophy or et cetera adaptation. So, there's real beauty in learning to love working out hard, but to leaving the gym or ending the run with 10 to 20% of the gas in the tank, and knowing that you can come back and do more, and you actually kind of want to do more. It increases vigor, as opposed to taking yourself over that cliff, even a slight 10 to 20%, and then finding that you're kind of depleted. And this is something that we don't hear enough about, because most people that are into fitness are into pushing themselves. It's also true for work. I think some of the best advice I ever got in the professional landscape was when I was a graduate student at UC Berkeley, and an excellent neurologist by the name of Bob Knight said, the key is to figure out how much can you work each day consistently. If that's 4 hours a day, fine. If that's 8 hours a day, fine. We're talking with weekend breaks, because that was in the era of weekend breaks. Maybe a weekend every once in a while where you have a deadline. But by thinking about what you personally can really do consistently while maintaining sleep and mental health and physical health, you're gonna go a lot further than doing, like, for instance, what I did, which is, maniac and working 100-hour weeks as a graduate student and then ending up sick 4 times a year and missing out on a bunch of days when I could have been in lab. So these days I try and get as much focused work done as possible, but try and make that as consistent as possible, if not from every day to the next, over time. Figure out what those averages are and don't be ashamed of those averages. I would say declare those averages to people so they know what to expect. And the fact that you can do more does not necessarily mean that you should do more, because I think one of the best pieces of advice I ever got in the world of fitness is more important than training hard, more important than doing any particular exercises, more important than anything is to not get hurt. Because if you get hurt, you can't train. So I love that you're doing NSDR after training. I love that you're making that part of your practice, but maybe also throttle back a little bit, because you said I have to do it after training. Maybe throttle back a little bit on the duration or intensity of exercise and see how you feel. What can we do to optimize the function of our gut-brain axis? That's very simple. Get enough sleep. In addition to that, avoid excessive intake of antibiotics, but if your doctor prescribes them, take them. I am a believer in antibiotics, okay, before the internet jumps on me. I'm not anti-antibiotic. I always want to say that. I'm not anti-antibiotic. I am not pro-antibiotic, but I am pro-probiotics. I'm probiotic. So I think you should ingest 1 to 4 servings of low sugar fermented foods per day, so sauerkraut, kimchi, natto, or kefir, or otherwise whatever you like and fits with your nutrition preferences and plan. I think it's also very important that you don't overuse antiseptics like antiseptic mouthwashes and hand rinses and all that stuff. This was all discussed on a podcast episode I did with Dr. Justin Sonnenberg on the Huberman Lab podcast, which is just to say that Justin, who's a professor at Stanford and is amazing, even said that he lets his kids eat lunch when they've been playing outside without washing their hands before eating lunch, because he wants the probiotic makeup of their gut to be diverse, including from outside. Now, I'm presuming that's not a public park. I'm assuming it's their yard, so we're not talking about gross stuff being on their hands. We're talking about a little dirt here and there. Turns out owning a pet increases the diversity of your microbiome. Lots of things like that. I mean, you don't want to go around, licking people's pets. It's okay to let them lick you, and depending on what your preferences are, but don't lick them. But when you interact with people, you shake their hands or pets, you're increasing the diversity of your microbiome. When you eat low sugar fermented foods, you want to make sure also you get enough fiber, both prebiotic and probiotic fiber, so fruits and vegetables. The fiber debate for me just makes me roll my eyes. I mean, it's so clear that fiber is good for us, for gut motility and for offsetting cancers of the gut. I mean, I realize there are the people out there who are really into elimination diets where they just only eat meat, but I mean, there's just so much good data on fiber, especially from fibrous vegetables. It just seems like, yes. I mean, it's almost silly that we have the debate, frankly, but I'm sure someone out there who's pure carnivore will be shouting. I love to exercise. I know to some people this might seem foreign, but I love to exercise. I love to do resistance training. I love to run. I am not one of those people that doesn't like the experience of exercising, but likes the feeling afterwards, quote unquote. I hear that a lot. I don't like to exercise, but I love the way I feel afterwards. I love physical training and I love the way I feel afterwards, but I mostly love the feeling during. I don't know why I'm wired that way. I can't say that I'm somebody who likes to do hard things across the board. There are plenty of difficult things in life that I dread or that I'm sort of meh about. But for me, hard exercise, intense exercise of a particular kind, resistance training and running in particular, both give me a yum. Yes, I love this kind of feeling. And yes, it persists for me quite a long while afterwards, both for sake of the way that it changes my neurochemistry, but also my sense of satisfaction. But I just simply love it. Now, years ago, I discovered that if I drink a cup of black coffee or an Americano or a double espresso or some yerba mate, that my workouts can be quite a bit more intense. I can run further. And then I also discovered that if I were to take a pre-workout energy drink, or I took, say, 300 milligrams of alpha GPC and 500 milligrams of phenylethylamine, and perhaps even 500 milligrams of L-tyrosine, and perhaps did that alongside the caffeine and the yerba mate, then yes, absolutely, I really liked those workouts. I could be like a laser in terms of focus. I could exert even more effort, put on some music, and I could achieve even better performance. And then I also discovered that I could export that protocol of caffeine, yerba mate, and various supplements to my cognitive work. So when I was studying or writing papers or writing grants or in the laboratory, when I was doing experiments with my hands in those days, cutting brain tissue and staining it and working really long hours. And I discovered that all of those things, all of those behaviors compounded with my love of exercise and my love of doing science and gave me these big peaks in what to me felt like even important experiences. They felt, unlike anything else. They were just so peak in their nature, which was great. And it did indeed enhance my performance. However, while it did not create a dependency for those different substances, caffeine, supplements, etc., what I noticed was that in the days and sometimes weekends afterwards, even though for much of my career, I confess I've worked weekends as well, but I would notice that I'd experience a real trough in energy. I just would not feel that good. And then if I kept up those behaviors consistently, and I was consistently adding in these other, let's just call them what they are, dopamine releasing or stimulating behaviors and substances, that my enthusiasm for physical training or running or for doing experiments actually started to diminish. And this was really discouraging to me at the time because I started to think, okay, maybe I'm burnt out. Maybe I have adrenal burnout, which, by the way, doesn't exist, folks. Your adrenals don't burn out. There is something called adrenal insufficiency syndrome. You can overstimulate your system by way of too much adrenaline, epinephrine, and norepinephrine, but that's a separate thing. There's no such thing as adrenal burnout per se. But I didn't know that. So I thought, gosh, I'm really burnt out. When in fact, it's now obvious to me what I was doing. I was combining too many dopamine releasing or stimulating behaviors and substances for things that I already enjoyed doing as behaviors, namely exercise and doing experiments. Anything related to science, actually. So what this means is not to avoid taking things or doing things that amplify your amount of dopamine, but to be very cautious about how often one does that and how many different dopamine stimulating behaviors or compounds one stacks, especially in terms of taking those things or stacking those things in and around behaviors that you already really enjoy doing. I was essentially just creating another version of the kids in nursery school or first grade with the gold star experiment. I was basically just doing the exact same thing. And when I realized that, and I changed my relationship to those compounds, I didn't eliminate them altogether, but I started realizing, for instance, that I didn't need to double up on yerba mate and coffee every workout. Sometimes I would do one, sometimes I would do the other. Frankly, I always do one or the other. It's rare that I ever do any kind of physical training without some caffeine first, and I do my physical training typically in the early part of the day, so that's fine, doesn't interfere with my sleep. I might do a hike without caffeine, but if I'm in a weight trainer, I'm going to run, I tend to drink coffee beforehand or have yerba mate. Or if I occasionally, meaning about once every third, sometimes every other, but usually about every third workout, I'll take 300 milligrams of alpha GPC, maybe occasionally, maybe every third or fourth workout. And these are resistance workouts, mind you, not running. I'll take 500 milligrams of L-tyrosine, or more typically 500 milligrams of phenylethylamine. And very, very rarely, maybe once every 2 or 3 months, I might stack all of those things together prior to a workout. But of course, I'm always mindful to also include workouts or runs or bouts of cognitive work. So that could be grant writing, prepping for a podcast, etc., where I don't do anything prior. Maybe just my caffeine, because I have a baseline level of caffeine that I use each day to function like many people. There's a baseline level of caffeine that just allows us to function if we're a perpetual user of caffeine. I talked a lot about this on the episode on caffeine. But the key here is be cautious. I would say be very cautious about stacking and layering in too many dopamine peak-inducing behaviors all at once on a regular basis. The key point here is if you are somebody that can engage in these intrinsically joyful activities for you, these activities that you're really motivated to do, whether or not it's skiing or playing music or dancing, etc., without the need to layer in additional dopamine releasing mechanisms or compounds or activities, well then I highly recommend you do that, because then you are essentially making yourself one of those fortunate few that does not require additional stimuli and therefore can hold on to that pleasure, can hold on to that intrinsic pleasure and motivation to engage in these behaviors over time, which frankly, there is no replacement for. There is no pill or bottle or potion or motivational speech or podcast or book that can replace intrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is perhaps the holy grail of all human endeavors and behaviors, because it encompasses so much of what brought us to this point in our species evolution, and also what brings each and every one of us closer and closer to our goals. And if it's happening with enjoyment without the need to layer in additional tools, well then you have really tapped into the source. And when I say the source, I don't mean it in any kind of mystical way. I think it's quite clear by now that when we hear about chi from Eastern medicine, or we talk about motivation, drive, and pursuit in Western neurobiological language as it relates to dopamine, or we hear about the source, maybe in my podcast episode with the one and only Rick Rubin, an incredibly productive music producer who's has just an unbelievable track record in terms of creative endeavors, and he talks about the source, we're really talking about the same thing, which is this set of circuits within us that allow us to identify what we want and then lean into effort, and then to do that in a persistent way that allows us to reach our goals. And if we can do that with an intrinsic sense of pleasure, well, that is nothing short of magic. The thing about cell phones is when you first get on there and you haven't, let's say you're no Wi-Fi on the flight or something, and you land, it can actually be quite stimulating. You get a lot of dopamine. Oh, there's this. Oh, there's that. But very quickly, when you're scrolling on social media, you're no longer getting the novelty, but you're continuing to do it and you almost don't know why you're doing it. At that point, it shifts over to something that's a bit more like an obsessive compulsive behavior, where we can define an obsessive compulsive behavior where the obsession leads to a compulsion. So the obsession is a thought, the compulsion is a behavior, but the acting out of the compulsion merely serves to increase the obsession. Right? This is very different than being obsessed with food or obsessed with cleanliness.
There's no payoff.
Right, exactly. There's no anxiety relief by carrying out the compulsion. With OCD behaviors, like scrolling social media, the dopamine quickly wanes, and then you find that you're just and we've all been there, you're scrolling, and like, why am I doing this? This isn't that interesting. This isn't that interesting. Now, the algorithms for social media are very clever, and I don't want to demonize it. I provide a lot of my life is spent on, on social media now, but in the algorithms that they've incorporated function on the most powerful way to keep people doing a behavior, or an animal for that matter, is intermittent random reward, or random intermittent reward, that you don't know when you're going to hit the jackpot. So you're scrolling, and then you see something. Typically it's very high, what, in nerd speak, we'd say signal to noise. So if you're reading some interesting things, this came out in the news, this came out, and then it's all of a sudden a riot, or a person that is base jumping off a building, or, for people that are scrolling, looking at bodies or something like that, live bodies. Hopefully people aren't looking at dead bodies. But look, if something's very tragic, then that has this gravitational pull. And then what happens is you start getting the system working for that next dopamine hit that you don't know when it's going to come. It's just like gambling. So I look at social media as initially being very dopaminergic, driving reward, surprise, and excitement, but very quickly transitioning to something more like OCD and the kinds of behaviors where it looks, if we were to look at ourselves through the lens of an experiment, like we would an animal experiment, we think that animal is sick. If you saw an animal digging in the corner, looking for a bone, the dog is looking, you'd think, that's really sad. That's us, right? That's us. I'm pointing at myself intentionally. That's us. So we have to learn to self-regulate the amount of time. But that doesn't have to be a process of, scruffing ourselves and saying, don't do it, don't do it. Think about it in terms of the positive. The more time away from something, the more positively reinforcing it will be when you return. And that, just to sort of superimpose this onto the relationship conversation, many of us are fortunate to have partners that we love spending a lot of time with. It's also good to miss that person every once in a while. Now, that might be an hour for some people apart of no communication. It might be a week. Everyone varies on this spectrum. But the idea of missing someone is that positive anticipation, that kind of pain, right? It's a motivational state. And then when you see them, it's all the richer. So dopamine detox, I would have thought, was not something real. It seemed kind of silly to me, actually. And I'll tell you why it seems silly and why it still seems silly, but why it may have some utility. But then Dr. Anna Lembke, told me that it actually can be quite useful to take some time and space away from social media, certainly from any addictive drugs. That's the treatment for addiction, and restore those dopamine levels to baseline. Now, the way that dopamine detoxing was initially described in the Bay Area, where it seemed a lot of tech types were talking about it, was in terms of, I heard something like, people aren't even looking at other people's faces. They're really kind of living in this like monkish lifestyle, like no food that they really enjoy, no anything. That to me seems kind of crazy and kind of extreme. I mean, I can understand not ingesting a lot of highly palatable foods, eating some blander foods. I can understand certainly not doing any prescription drugs or taking some time off from caffeine. Caffeine increases dopamine receptors, which makes the dopamine that's available more powerful at evoking the dopamine response. I can understand avoiding certain substances and behaviors, but the idea that you weren't going to look people in the eye because there's going to be too much dopamine, I mean, I guess it depends on who you're looking in the eye and how much their look positively arouses you. But the fact of the matter is that that's not a very rational way to think about dopamine detox. But staying out of high intensity, highly rewarding activities, I think could be useful in terms of reestablishing that dopamine balance. And everything we know from Anna's work is that dopamine, if you drive those dopaminergic states too long, addictive drugs, etc., people can do this with sex, food, drugs, gambling, social media, all sorts of things, pornography. What ends up happening is the amount of dopamine that's released over time goes down and down and down and down, and pretty much is traversing into the territory of pain. And then people, again, are back to this thing where, they're scrolling internet porn 8, 9, 10 times or hours a day, and then they're wondering why this isn't effective for them anymore, whereas it was before. And there's an additional issue with pornography, which is not often discussed, which is that, remember, guys in particular, the brain is a learning prediction machine. And I'm not trying to say that all pornography is bad, but there are good data to support the idea that if your brain learns to be aroused by watching other people have sex, it is not necessarily going to carry over to the ability to get aroused when you're one-on-one with somebody else, right? Especially young kids who are consuming a lot of pornography, the brain is learning sexual arousal to other people having sex.
So you're going to program yourself into being a voyeur?
Or just create challenges in sexual interactions with peers, with a real partner. Right?
Mary Harrington has the 3 laws of pornodynamics, and the second law of pornodynamics is the law of FAP entropy. And it says that whatever you start out wanking to will get progressively more intense over time. And I think that this is sort of speaking to that ever sort of escalating amount of the wildness that you need to watch in order to get an ever decreasing stimulus that comes back.
Yeah, and here I'm approaching this only through the lens of biology, right? I'm not a psychologist, and I'm certainly not political in any way. At least not. I have ideas about politics, but I just don't discuss them publicly. But the idea here is that I'm not saying pornography as a stimulus is bad or good. What I'm saying is it, in its availability and its extreme forms, it's a very potent stimulus, and very potent stimuli of any kind, extremely palatable food, extreme pornography, extreme experiences like bungee cord jumping, those set a threshold for dopamine release. And Anna will tell you that, and I'm sure she did, that the higher the dopamine peak, the bigger the drop afterwards. And it's not that you drop to baseline, you drop below baseline. So again, it's not, these things aren't good or bad, they just have to be controlled in a way, because When people are pursuing dopamine peaks over and over and over, and they aren't getting them, typically it's because they've been pursuing that activity far too often. The key thing here is that, and this is the beauty of the dopamine system, just like the stress system is generic, the fear system is generic, it's designed for a bunch of different scenarios. The motivation system is also generic. It can be to achieve the next lamppost as a milestone, or it can be 5 miles as the next milestone. You get to control that. And so it's completely arbitrary, right? I mean, one of the most brilliant things that was ever said to me by an extremely skilled psychoanalyst is so simple, and yet I do think it's the most fundamental thing to understanding oneself, is that it's all internal, right? If you finish a marathon in first place, no one comes along and drips dopamine in your ear. You self-generate that. It's all internal. It's all about your internal representation. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't good and bad events in life, but the fact of the matter is that if you set the next milestone as just outside the distance of what you're comfortable with, and you make it there, if you allow yourself a moment to register that win, you get energy to then set the next milestone and achieve it. That energy is dopamine converted into epinephrine, into adrenaline. I try and get to bed by about 10, maybe 11 p.m. I don't always succeed. I wake up around 6 a.m. or so. If I don't sleep enough or I don't feel rested, I'll do a 10 to 20 minute, maybe 30 minute NSDR or Yoga Nidra. I get up, I like to hydrate. First thing I try and do is drink 16 to 32 ounces of water. I like just hydrate in the morning. Get outside and get some sunlight. If I can't get the sunlight, I get in front of that 10,000 lux light. I prefer to work out early in the day, in which case I'll drink caffeine if it's a resistance training workout. For me, that's yerba mate or coffee or both sometimes. I'll just tell you my workout schedule is really easy to hit on. Same thing I've been doing roughly for 30 years, although sometimes I've been less focused on it and let it lapse a bit here and there. So first day of the week, for me, it falls on a Monday, but it could be any day. I train my legs. Calves, hamstrings, quads. I'm a big believer in glute ham raises, hack squats, leg curls, leg extensions, calf raises. Just keep the lower body strong, keep the posterior chain strong. There are a bunch of different ways to do this. One can do it with kettlebell swings or deadlifts, but those are the things that work well for me and that I can consistently add load or other ways of increasing intensity without getting hurt. Okay, knock on wood. The whole thing takes about an hour. Next day is a rest day, typically after leg day, and I'll try and don't always do, but some deliberate heat and deliberate cold exposure. In an ideal world, it's 20 minutes of sauna, 3 to 5 minutes of cold, 20 minutes of sauna, 3 to 5 minutes of cold, 20 minutes of sauna, 3 to 5 minutes of cold. And yes, I finish with a warm shower because I'm a human being, and I like that. And I will listen to podcasts or books or something while I do it, and helps my recovery. It's also just thermal training. It has all the benefits of sauna and cold, and I like to do it on that day. The next day, I'll do typically a run, a 25 or 30 minute run at a kind of faster pace. So where I'm, breathing hard for most of it, but it's not all out, maybe 85% of effort. And that's it. The next day I train my torso. I know a lot of people roll their eyes and be like, what are you talking about? How do you, I do some overhead pressing, some dips, some pull-ups or chin-ups, and some rowing. And then I do some abdominal work, and I train my neck because it's an important part of the structure of the upper body to keep the head stable and not get text neck and things like that. I don't train it heavy, but I train my neck, and I do make sure I do things like rear delts. I really am trying to emphasize, outward, external rotation of the limbs, so we're not, kind of like hunched over like this and heavy in the traps, just upright posture, those kinds of things. And then the next day, the only workout is about 10 minutes long. It's that 10-second hard cycling on the assault bike, 20-second rest, 10, 20, 10, 20 for 8 rounds. That's it, VO2 max. Saturdays, another short resistance training workout, so 3 total for the week. And then it's, biceps, triceps, calves, little neck work, abdominal work. It's kind of just small body part stuff. And then on Sunday, which for me falls on a Sunday, I try and do some long ruck or hike often socially, put on a backpack with some weight, or if I'm by myself, I'll do, a 60 to 90 minute jog or something of that sort. Maybe hike part of it and listen to music or just let my thoughts go. So what it boils down to is 6 days of training per week, 3 resistance training sessions, 1 longer slow run, 1 moderate one, and 1 short one. The total amount of time is actually quite low when you think about it. And then there's that rest day where I may or may not do the heat and cold. This schedule I could micro dissect, but what ends up happening with this schedule is because, for instance, I'll train my legs on Monday directly, but I'm doing the assault bike for HIIT on Friday. So my legs sort of get targeted twice per week, once directly, once indirectly. So I don't have to worry about too little frequency of stimulation for things like strength and hypertrophy, although I'm not trying to grow anymore, for maintaining muscle. Similarly, I'll train my torso on that one day during the middle of the week, but you're using your arms for that, and then you train your arms directly another day. And on the arm day, I'm doing some dip-like things, and so you're also hitting your torso muscle. So I never worry that it's not frequent enough. I find that getting into the gym more than 3 days per week or doing resistance training more than 3 days per week, I start to lose my motivation for it. But I like to be really focused and targeted when I'm there. And I love long runs, I love moderate runs, and I love the HIIT workout. So I get to do a little bit of everything. And I really want to emphasize that because I'm not a professional athlete or even an amateur athlete, the whole basis of this thing is to be able to do anything. Meaning I can go for a long hike or backpack during the summer with a heavy pack, no problem. I can sprint for the airplane, no problem. I can lift things without hurting myself, no problem, provided I'm smart about it. I'm not trying to be the strongest, the biggest, or the fastest, or the one with the most endurance. Just kind of all around life. And none of these workouts is longer than an hour, and in many cases they're 12 minutes or 30 minutes. The daily routine is pretty much consistent, and I should say that schedule, if I travel, things might slide a bit. I might move day 1 next to day 2. I move things around, but I'm careful to never weight train more than 2 days in a row. I personally don't recover. I don't like doing that. Okay, nutrition, I just try and emphasize non-processed or minimally processed foods. I'm not really hungry until about 11 a.m. And then I like some meat, some berries, some rice or oatmeal sometimes, and some vegetable. I'm not low carb. In the afternoon, I'll generally have a snack, maybe a protein drink, some nuts. I do eat, those Maui Nui jerky sticks or a thing of bone broth or something. It's not promotion, it's just a fact. And then for dinner, I tend to emphasize less protein. For me, that works. This runs counter to what everyone says, but I like more vegetables, pasta, rice, risottos. Occasionally, I'll go out for a big steak or something like that. But generally, the heavier on the starches, not heavy, but heavier on the starches relatively, and vegetables, and then a couple hours before sleep, ideally. But sometimes I'll finish dinner and collapse. It's just life. I do find that I sleep better if I allow a few hours before sleep. In terms of stress modulation and things like that, I do deploy the physiological sigh, which sounds very technical, but 2 inhales through the nose, followed by a long exhale to lungs empty. I try and do that anytime I feel that my stress is too high. My lab published a clinical trial in Cell Reports Medicine in collaboration with David Spiegel's laboratory at Stanford, showing that 5 minutes a day of breath work of cyclic sighing, so inhale, exhale, both inhales through the nose, inhale, exhale, done as a dedicated practice for 5 minutes a day, led to some interesting changes, positive changes in reductions in resting heart rate, reductions in blood pressure, improvements in sleep, mood, etc. Not all significant, but several which were statistically significant. But I don't tend to do breath work. I tend to just use the physiological sigh whenever I'm feeling kind of overly ramped up. So what I found for me is that, the core set of supplements plus training right, plus life, lived in the way I described, some hydration, etc., that seems to work best. And what's my measure of that is feelings of vigor, whether or not I can recover from my workouts, meaning am I getting any progress in terms of loads or other intensity variables or distance or speed over time with the cardiovascular stuff. And the answer is yes, small improvements over time are really what I'm after, or maintaining what I've got. Because at 48, I'm just interested in staying healthy and sure, would love to be even healthier, but I'm also paying attention to how much cognitive vigor I have. If I'm training so much or paying so much attention to nutrition that I can't engage in work and function, that's not good. If I can't sit for 3 hours and have a conversation because I'm in pain, that's not good. And fortunately, I've got things in a place where I feel generally good, sometimes great, but good most of the time. I still get bad night's sleep every once in a while. I still stress, I don't tend to do cheat days or things like that. I love the occasional piece of pizza or croissant or something like that. But I've also learned that most of the things about taking great care from nutrition, lifestyle, mindset, and the rest creates a kind of a heightened sensory experience of life. This is what I think people miss. They think of it as deprivation, but when you're doing these things and you do them consistently, I find at least that, first of all, I love the foods I eat. I love meat, fish, chicken, eggs, vegetables, certain starches, fruit, etc. That I enjoy all of those things, and I also enjoy all of life so much more. Whereas I find that things, for me anyway, alcohol, highly processed foods, they create a kind of cloak over my senses. I don't enjoy life as much. But of course, a really good cookie, or sure, that makes sense. And I enjoy those. So I look at things as all of it: exercise, nutrition, supplementation, any kind of NSDR, things like that, as do they allow me to lean into life with more vigor, with more curiosity, with more texture, or do they kind of consume a lot of time and don't allow me to do that? And in my experience, the things that I described, and there are a few others that I do, allow me to live life better, right? It's not like I'm sleeping all the time, or I'm neurotically saying, okay, everybody, it's 8:30, I got to go to sleep, And look, I respect people's individual choices. I actually, the other day, saw for the first time in a long time Brian Johnson, who's, he's wholeheartedly and whole everything, devoting his entire energy to being the most measured human and longevity stuff. And that's what floats his boat. Me, I like to have some flexibility on my schedule in life. And if it costs me a few years of life, I'm willing to make that trade.